the vast and seemingly endless expanse of Eastern Europe, stretching from the cold shores of the Baltic Sea in the north to the warm waters of the Black Sea in the south, and from the dense forests of the Carpathian Mountains in the west to the endless rolling steppes in the east, presented in the centuries preceding the emergence of the Rus a remarkably complex and intricate tapestry of indigenous peoples who had lived upon these lands for countless generations, of nascent trade networks that connected distant communities through rivers and forest paths, and of the earliest stirrings of what would eventually become one of history's most significant and enduring cultural syntheses, a blending of peoples and traditions that would shape the destiny of millions for centuries to come. Archaeological excavations conducted across the great river systems of this region, including the mighty Dnieper with its countless tributaries flowing through forests and meadows, the broad Volga stretching toward the distant Caspian Sea, and the numerous northern waterways that connected the interior lands with the Baltic shores, have revealed to patient scholars and careful researchers a landscape that was far from empty or desolate, but rather populated by sophisticated societies whose material culture and settlement patterns would profoundly and permanently influence the later development of what we now call Rus civilization. The Dnieper River Basin, that great artery of human settlement and cultural exchange, stretches from the gentle Valda Hills in the north, where springs bubble forth from the earth, to begin their long journey southward, all the way to the Black Sea, where the river finally empties its waters after traveling through hundreds of kilometers of varied terrain. And this magnificent waterway served as the primary route for human movement and the exchange of goods, ideas, and traditions throughout the entire first millennium of the Common Era, witnessing the passage of countless traders, warriors, settlers, and pilgrims who traveled its waters in search of fortune, safety, or spiritual fulfillment. Archaeological evidence recovered from sites such as Chernigov and Kiev, cities that would later become great centers of Rus civilization, indicates continuous human habitation dating back to the Paleolithic period, when small bands of hunters followed the great herds of animals across the landscape, and continuing through the Bronze Age, when settlements began showing increasingly sophisticated agricultural practices and metalworking techniques that allowed communities to produce tools, weapons, and ornaments of remarkable quality and beauty. The Chernyakov culture, which flourished between the 2nd and 5th centuries of the Common Era, left extensive traces of fortified settlements along the middle Dnieper, and these archaeological remains are characterized by distinctive pottery styles that reveal both practical skill and artistic sensibility, by advanced ironworking techniques that produced tools and weapons of exceptional quality, and by evidence of long-distance trade connections extending all the way to the Roman Empire, demonstrating that even in these early centuries, the peoples of Eastern Europe were connected to the wider Mediterranean world through networks of commerce and cultural exchange. Excavations at the site known as Gnezdovo, located near the modern city of Smolensk, have uncovered one of the most significant archaeological complexes in all of Eastern Europe, revealing layer upon layer of occupation spanning several centuries, and providing invaluable insights into the lives of the people who inhabited this strategic location at the confluence of important trade routes, where rivers met and goods changed hands, where travelers rested and shared news from distant lands, and where different peoples encountered one another and exchanged not only material goods, but also ideas, beliefs, and ways of understanding the world. The strategic position of Gnezdovo at the junction of multiple trade routes demonstrates with remarkable clarity the importance of river confluences in early settlement patterns, for it was at such locations that communities could control the movement of goods and people, could collect tolls and taxes from passing merchants, could provide services to travelers in need of rest and resupply, and could accumulate the wealth and influence that allowed them to grow from simple trading posts into significant centers of political and economic power. Burial mounds at Gnezdovo contain artifacts ranging from Byzantine coins, those small metal discs that traveled thousands of kilometers from the workshops of Constantinople to find their final resting place in the cold earth of the northern forests, to Scandinavian weapons, the swords and axes and spearheads that speak of warriors who came from across the Baltic Sea to seek their fortunes in the east. And this remarkable diversity of grave goods indicates the cosmopolitan nature of these early trading centers, where people from many different lands and cultures lived and worked and died together. The presence of Arabic silver dirhams in substantial quantities at sites throughout the region suggests established commercial relationships extending far beyond the immediate area, connecting the forests and rivers of Eastern Europe with the great cities of the Islamic world, where skilled craftsmen produced the silver coins that would travel northward along trade routes, passing through many hands before finally coming to rest in the hoards and graves of the northern lands, silent witnesses to the vast networks of exchange that linked distant civilizations. The Volga River system presented an equally complex archaeological landscape, with Finno-Ugric peoples establishing permanent settlements along its banks as early as the first millennium before the Common Era, and these communities developed over many generations into sophisticated societies with their own distinctive cultures, technologies, and ways of life that would later interact with and influence the Slavic peoples, who would eventually come to dominate the region. The Dakovo culture, centered around the upper Volga and Oka rivers, developed distinctive hill forts characterized by elaborate earthwork, defenses that required substantial communal labor to construct and maintain, and by evidence of specialized craft production that indicates a level of social organization and economic complexity that challenges simplistic notions of these early peoples as primitive or unsophisticated. Archaeological findings from these Diakovo sites include bone and antler tools crafted with remarkable skill and precision, iron weapons that demonstrate advanced metallurgical knowledge, and pottery decorated with intricate geometric patterns that would later influence Slavic decorative traditions, creating a visual language that connected generations across the centuries and linked the artistic expressions of different peoples through shared aesthetic sensibilities. Finno-Ugric tribal territories extended across vast swaths of northern and central Russia, with the Maria people occupying the region between the Volga and Oka rivers, while the Muroma controlled territories along the lower Oka, and these groups developed sophisticated fishing and hunting economies supplemented by limited agriculture in favorable locations where the soil and climate permitted the cultivation of crops. Their settlements typically featured semi-subterranean dwellings, constructed with wooden frameworks and covered with earth, designs that were perfectly adapted to withstand the harsh northern winters when temperatures dropped far below freezing and snow covered the land for months at a time. And archaeological evidence suggests these communities maintained extensive trade networks, exchanging furs, amber, and honey for metal goods and luxury items from southern regions. Baltic tribal territories encompassed much of present-day Lithuania, Latvia, and parts of Belarus and northwestern Russia, and the Baltic peoples, including the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Latvians, developed distinct material cultures characterized by sophisticated metalworking, particularly in bronze and iron, creating objects of both practical utility and remarkable beauty that have survived in the archaeological record to tell us of their makers' skill and artistry. Their burial practices, involving elaborate grave goods and distinctive pottery styles, provide insight into complex social hierarchies and belief systems that govern the lives of these ancient peoples, revealing societies where status and identity were expressed through material possessions and where the dead were honored with gifts that would accompany them into whatever afterlife they believed awaited beyond the threshold of death. Archaeological sites, such as those near Lake Peipus, reveal fortified settlements with evidence of specialized craft production and long-distance trade connections, demonstrating that even in these northern regions, far from the great centers of Mediterranean civilization, communities were linked to wider networks of exchange that brought goods and ideas from distant lands. The ancient trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire through the river networks of Eastern Europe represented one of the most significant economic and cultural phenomena of the pre-Rus period. And these waterways, later known collectively as the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and peoples across vast distances, creating connections that would shape the future development of the entire region. The northern terminus of this route system began in the Baltic, where Scandinavian traders could access the Neva River and Lake Ladoga, continuing south through the Volkhov River to Lake Ilmen and the Lavat River, and from Lake Ilmen traders faced the crucial portage to the Dnieper system, a journey that required intimate knowledge of local geography and the cooperation of indigenous peoples who controlled the overland routes between the river systems. Archaeological evidence from portage sites reveals the establishment of permanent settlements to facilitate this transfer of goods, with specialized equipment for moving heavy cargo overland, and these portage points became focal points for cultural exchange, where Scandinavian Slavic and Finno-Ugric peoples interacted regularly, sharing knowledge, trading goods, and gradually creating the mixed communities that would characterize the emerging Rus civilization. The Dnieper Rapids, located south of present-day Kiev, presented both an obstacle and an opportunity for ancient traders, for while the treacherous waters made navigation dangerous and sometimes impossible, the necessity of portaging around the rapids created natural gathering points where merchants would wait for favorable conditions, where goods would be transferred between vessels, and where the different peoples who traveled these waters would encounter one another and exchange not only merchandise but also stories, songs, and ways of understanding the world. Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, the learned Byzantine emperor, who compiled detailed information about the peoples and places of his empire's northern frontier, later documented the names of these rapids in both Slavic and Norse languages, suggesting their significance to multiple cultural groups and providing valuable evidence of the multilingual, multicultural nature of the communities that developed along this crucial waterway. Archaeological investigation of sites near the rapids reveals evidence of seasonal camps, where trading expeditions would wait for favorable conditions to navigate the treacherous waters. And these locations became centers of cultural synthesis, where different peoples shared knowledge of river navigation, local geography, and trading practices, gradually developing the common understandings and shared techniques that would facilitate the growth of long-distance commerce. Early Scandinavian exploration into the Eastern European river systems began as seasonal trading expeditions driven by the demand for luxury goods in Western Europe and the availability of valuable commodities in the East. And archaeological evidence from Staraya Ladoga, one of the earliest Scandinavian settlements in Eastern Europe, indicates continuous occupation from the mid-8th century, making it one of the oldest known sites of Scandinavian presence in the region. The site's strategic location at the confluence of the Volkhov River and the Ladoga Canal provided access to both the Baltic trade network and the interior river systems, creating an ideal position for controlling the flow of goods between Scandinavia and the wealthy markets of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Scandinavian traders brought with them distinctive material culture, including characteristic boat construction techniques that allowed them to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, weapon styles that reflected their warrior traditions, and decorative arts that expressed their aesthetic sensibilities and religious beliefs. and their presence is archaeologically detectable through the distribution of specific artifact types, including oval brooches worn by Scandinavian women, Thor's hammer pendants that invoke the protection of the thunder god, and distinctive sword types with pattern-welded blades that represented the highest achievements of Northern European metallurgy. However, these early Scandinavian expeditions were not conquest-oriented but rather focused on establishing trading relationships with indigenous peoples. For the Scandinavians recognized that successful commerce required cooperation with local communities who possessed knowledge of the land, controlled access to valuable resources, and could provide the labor and services necessary for long-distance trade. The seasonal nature of these early expeditions is evidenced by the archaeological record, which shows periods of intensive activity alternating with apparent abandonment at many sites, and this pattern suggests that Scandinavian traders initially maintained their primary residences in Scandinavia, while conducting extended trading voyages during favorable seasons when the rivers were navigable and the weather permitted travel. The gradual transition from seasonal to permanent settlement is visible in the archaeological record through changes in building construction, with temporary shelters giving way to more substantial structures designed for year-round occupation, through the establishment of workshops for producing goods locally rather than importing everything from Scandinavia, and through evidence of year-round activity, such as agriculture and animal husbandry, that indicate communities had become self-sustaining rather than dependent on supplies from their homeland. Indigenous peoples of Eastern Europe demonstrated remarkable adaptability in their interactions with both early Slavic migrations and Scandinavian trading expeditions, and the Finnic tribes, including the Vies, Chud, and Mirya, possessed extensive knowledge of river navigation and forest resources that proved invaluable to foreign traders who sought to penetrate the interior of the continent. Archaeological evidence suggests these groups actively participated in long-distance trade networks, serving as intermediaries between Scandinavian traders and more distant indigenous communities, and their role in facilitating commerce gave them influence and prosperity that is reflected in the rich grave goods found in their burial sites. The relationship between indigenous peoples and incoming Slavic populations appears to have been largely peaceful, based on archaeological evidence showing gradual cultural blending, rather than signs of violent conquest. And Slavic settlement patterns typically involve the establishment of new communities in previously unoccupied areas, suggesting a process of gradual territorial expansion rather than displacement of existing population. This pattern is particularly evident in the archaeological record of the Upper Dnieper region, where Slavic and Finnic material cultures appear alongside each other without evidence of conflict, suggesting that the two peoples found ways to coexist and cooperate, sharing the land and its resources while maintaining their distinct cultural identities. Nomadic groups, including various Turkic peoples and most significantly the Khazars, played crucial roles in the development of trade networks and political structures in Eastern Europe during the centuries before the emergence of the Rus state, and their influence on the region's economic, political, and cultural development cannot be overstated, for they controlled vital trade routes, maintained diplomatic relationships with major powers, and created political models that would influence the organization of later states. The Khazar Khaganate, with its capital at Itil on the Volga Delta, controlled much of the lower Volga trade route, and maintained diplomatic relations with both the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, positioning itself as a crucial intermediary in the commerce that flowed between these great civilizations. And archaeological evidence from Khazar sites reveals a sophisticated urban culture with evidence of diverse religious practices and extensive commercial activities that made the Khaganate one of the most prosperous and cosmopolitan states of the early medieval period. The interaction between sedentary and nomadic peoples created a complex web of relationships that would profoundly influence the later development of Rus society. For nomadic groups provided military expertise and knowledge of steppe warfare that would prove essential for defending against other nomadic threats, while sedentary populations contributed agricultural surplus and craft specialization that supported the growth of urban centers and long-distance trade. This symbiotic relationship is evidenced in archaeological sites where nomadic and sedentary material cultures appear together, suggesting periods of peaceful coexistence and mutual benefit when different peoples found ways to cooperate for their common advantage, sharing resources, exchanging goods, and learning from one another's technologies and traditions. The material culture of pre-Slavic Eastern Europe reveals sophisticated technological traditions that would later influence Rus development, and metalwork techniques, particularly in iron and bronze, reached high levels of sophistication among various indigenous groups, producing tools, weapons, and ornaments that demonstrate both technical skill and artistic sensibility. Archaeological finds include elaborately decorated weapons whose surfaces are covered with intricate patterns, jewelry of remarkable delicacy and beauty, and tools designed with careful attention to both function and form. And these objects demonstrate advanced craftsmanship and artistic sensibilities that would be gradually incorporated into Slavic material culture through processes of cultural exchange and intermarriage. Pottery traditions among indigenous peoples show remarkable diversity and sophistication, with distinctive regional styles that persisted even after Slavic settlement, and the integration of these ceramic traditions into Slavic culture is visible in archaeological assemblages, where traditional Slavic pottery types appear alongside indigenous forms, eventually leading to hybrid styles that combined elements from multiple traditions into new forms of artistic expression. Agricultural practices among pre-Slavic peoples varied considerably based on environmental conditions and cultural preferences, with the fertile black earth regions of the forest steppe zone supporting intensive grain cultivation that could produce substantial surpluses, while northern forest zones relied more heavily on slash-and-burn agriculture, supplemented by hunting, fishing, and gathering. These diverse agricultural strategies provided models for later Slavic settlers who adapted their farming practices to local environmental conditions, learning from indigenous peoples how to work the land effectively in different ecological zones, and developing the mixed agricultural economies that would support the growth of Rus civilization. The religious and spiritual practices of indigenous peoples left subtle but significant traces in the archaeological record, with burial practices, votive deposits, and sacred sites revealing complex belief systems that often incorporated elements of shamanism, ancestor worship, and nature reverence. And these spiritual traditions would later influence the development of Slavic paganism and, indirectly, the eventual Christianization of the Rus. The transformation of Eastern Europe during the 6th through 8th centuries represents one of the most significant demographic and cultural shifts in medieval history, as Slavic populations began their systematic eastward expansion from their presumed homeland in the region between the Vistula and Oder rivers, gradually spreading across the vast territories that would eventually become the heartland of Rus civilization. Archaeological evidence from across the Carpathian Basin indicates that by the late 5th century, Slavic populations had begun this momentous migration, and this movement was not a sudden exodus, but rather a gradual process spanning several generations, driven by a combination of population pressure as communities grew beyond the carrying capacity of their original territories, climatic changes that may have made some regions more attractive for settlement, and the political upheavals that followed the collapse of Hunnic power in Central Europe. The earliest Slavic settlements east of the Carpathians appear in the archaeological record around 550 AD, concentrated initially along the upper reaches of the Dniester and Prut rivers, and these pioneering communities established the characteristic Slavic settlement pattern that would define their expansion. Small agricultural villages positioned near reliable water sources, typically consisting of 10 to 20 semi-subterranean dwellings arranged in loose clusters that allowed for both community cooperation and individual family autonomy. The houses themselves, known from excavations at sites like Roshkov and Selishte, featured rectangular floor plans measuring approximately 4 by 5 meters, with central hearths that provided warmth and light during the long winter months, and storage pits carved directly into the earthen floors where families could keep their provisions safe from vermin and the elements. The material culture of these early Slavic settlers shows distinct continuity with their Western predecessors, while gradually incorporating elements from the indigenous populations they encountered, and pottery assemblages from 6th century sites reveal the characteristic handmade vessels with rough surfaces and minimal decoration that define early Slavic ceramic traditions, practical containers designed for everyday use rather than display. Iron tools, including plowshares for breaking the soil, sickles for harvesting grain, and axes for clearing forest land, demonstrate the agricultural focus of these communities, while the relative scarcity of weapons suggests the peaceful nature of the initial expansion phase, when Slavic settlers sought to establish themselves in new territories through hard work and cooperation rather than conquest. As Slavic populations moved eastward, they encountered the complex river systems that would become the backbone of their civilization, and the Dnieper River, with its extensive network of tributaries reaching into the forests and steppes, provided both a transportation route that connected distant communities and a source of fertile alluvial soils ideal for agriculture. Archaeological evidence from sites along the middle Dnieper, including Monastirish and Kotomel, reveals the establishment of larger settlements by the 7th century, some containing over 50 structures and showing evidence of specialized craft production that indicates the development of more complex social and economic organization. The process of Slavic settlement along major waterways followed predictable patterns based on environmental and strategic considerations, with communities typically establishing themselves on elevated terraces above river floodplains, positions that provided protection from seasonal flooding while maintaining access to water transportation and the fertile bottomlands where crops could be grown. The spacing between settlements averaged 15 to 20 kilometers, a distance that suggests territorial organization based on the productive capacity of surrounding agricultural lands and the practical limits of community defense, for each settlement needed enough land to support its population while remaining close enough to neighbors to provide mutual assistance in times of need. Archaeological investigation of these riverine settlements reveals increasingly sophisticated defensive arrangements as Slavic communities grew in size and wealth, and the earliest fortifications consisted of simple earthen ramparts, reinforced with wooden palisades, barriers that could deter casual raiders and provide time for communities to organize their defense. But by the late 7th century, more elaborate defensive systems had emerged, and the Gorodishchi at Zimno, located on the Bug River, exemplifies this evolution with its complex system of multiple ramparts, ditches, and wooden gate structures that controlled access to the settlement's interior, creating a formidable obstacle for any attacker. The development of fortified settlements represented a crucial transition in Slavic society, reflecting both increased prosperity that made communities attractive targets for raiders and growing security concerns as competition for resources intensified. And these городища served multiple functions beyond defense, acting as centers for craft production, trade, and political authority. Excavations at Kodomel have revealed evidence of specialized workshops for metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacture, indicating the emergence of economic specialization within Slavic communities where skilled craftsmen could devote themselves to their trades while relying on farmers to provide the food they needed. The internal organization of городища followed consistent patterns across the Slavic expansion zone, with the central area typically containing the largest and most elaborate structures, including communal buildings that may have served religious or administrative functions, places where the community could gather for ceremonies, councils, and celebrations. Surrounding these central structures, residential areas were organized in irregular clusters, with evidence suggesting that related families occupied adjacent dwellings, maintaining the kinship ties that provided social cohesion and mutual support. And storage facilities, including large grain pits and elevated granaries, were positioned throughout the settlement, reflecting the agricultural basis of Slavic economy. The eastward movement of Slavic populations brought them into contact with diverse indigenous groups, leading to complex processes of cultural exchange and territorial organization. And in the forest zone north of the Pripyat marshes, Slavic settlers encountered Finno-Ugric peoples who possessed extensive knowledge of forest resources and river navigation. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gorodok suggests that initial contact between these groups was peaceful, with Slavic agricultural techniques complementing indigenous hunting and fishing practices, and the two peoples found ways to share the land and its resources, each contributing their particular skills and knowledge to the emerging mixed communities. The emergence of distinct Eastern Slavic tribal confederations during the 7th and 8th centuries reflects the maturation of Slavic society and its adaptation to diverse environmental conditions across Eastern Europe. And these confederations, while not states in the modern sense, provided frameworks for cooperation, defense, and the resolution of disputes among related communities. The Polyang, whose name derives from the Slavic word for field dwellers, established themselves in the fertile lands around the Middle Dnieper, centered on the emerging settlement of Kiev, and archaeological evidence from Polyanian territory reveals extensive agricultural development, with field systems showing evidence of crop rotation and the cultivation of wheat, rye, millet, and barley. The Drevlian, or forest dwellers, occupied the heavily wooded regions west of the Dnieper, developing an economy that combined slash-and-burn agriculture with extensive exploitation of forest resources. And excavations at Drevlian sites reveal evidence of sophisticated woodworking traditions, including the construction of elaborate wooden fortifications and the production of wooden tools and implements. The abundance of iron slag at these sites indicates active metalworking, likely focused on producing agricultural tools and weapons needed for forest clearing and defense. And the Drevlian would later play a significant role in Rus history, their relationship with the ruling dynasty marked by both cooperation and violent conflict. North of Polyanian territory, the Severian established control over the lands along the Desna and Sime rivers, developing agricultural practices adapted to the transitional forest steppe environment. And Severian settlements show evidence of mixed farming strategies, combining grain cultivation with livestock raising and seasonal hunting. The material culture of Severian sites reflects this economic diversity, with archaeological assemblages containing both agricultural tools and hunting equipment, alongside evidence of trade connections extending south to the steppe regions, where nomadic peoples offered different goods and opportunities for exchange. The Krivichi emerged as the dominant Slavic group in the northern regions, controlling territories around the headwaters of the Dnieper, Volga, and western Dvina rivers. And this strategic position placed them at the center of emerging trade networks connecting the Baltic Sea with the interior river systems. Archaeological evidence from Krivichi settlements reveals early adoption of long-distance trade practices, with finds including Baltic amber, iron ore from bog deposits, and luxury goods from distant regions, demonstrating that even before the arrival of Scandinavian traders, Slavic communities were participating in networks of exchange that connected different parts of the continent. Krivichi settlement patterns differed significantly from their southern counterparts, reflecting adaptation to the northern forest environment and the opportunities presented by river trade. And their gorodichtha were typically positioned at river confluences or portage points, maximizing their control over transportation routes. The Gnezdovo complex, while showing later Scandinavian influence, began as a Krivichi settlement exploiting the strategic position between the Dnieper and western Dvina river systems, a location that would make it one of the most important trading centers in all of Eastern Europe. The tribal confederations that emerged during this period were not rigid political entities but rather loose associations of related communities sharing common cultural practices, dialects, and territorial interests, and leadership within these confederations appears to have been based on a combination of kinship ties, military prowess, and control over trade routes. Archaeological evidence suggests that political authority was exercised through a combination of consensus building and the personal charisma of individual leaders rather than through formal institutional structures. And this flexible system of governance allowed communities to cooperate when necessary while maintaining substantial local autonomy. The relationship between Slavic communities and the Khazar Kagati represents one of the most significant aspects of early Rus development. For the Khazars, a Turkic people who had established a powerful state controlling the lower Volga and much of the Pontic steppe, maintained extensive trade networks connecting the Islamic world with Northern Europe. Archaeological evidence from Khazar sites reveals a cosmopolitan, urban culture with sophisticated administrative systems and diverse religious practices, including the famous conversion of the Khazar elite to Judaism, a unique development that made the Khaganate one of the most religiously diverse states of the medieval world. Initial contact between Slavic communities and Khazar traders appears to have occurred during the late 7th century, as Slavic settlements expanded into the forest steppe regions that bordered Khazar territory. And the Khazars' primary interest in these northern regions centered on accessing the valuable fur trade and establishing secure routes for the transportation of goods between the Islamic world and Northern Europe. Slavic communities possessed both the forest resources and the river navigation knowledge that the Khazars needed to expand their commercial operation, and this complementarity of interests created opportunities for mutually beneficial relationships that would shape the economic development of the entire region. The development of trade relationships between Slavic communities and the Khazar Khaganate facilitated significant cultural and technological exchange, and Khazar merchants introduced Slavic traders to sophisticated commercial practices, including the use of standardized weights and measures, credit arrangements, and long-distance transportation techniques. Archaeological evidence from Slavic sites dating to this period shows the appearance of Khazar-style scales, wits, and other commercial equipment, indicating the adoption of Khazar trading practices that would later be incorporated into the commercial culture of the Rus state. The flow of goods through these trading relationships transformed the material culture of Slavic communities, as luxury items from the Islamic world, including silk textiles, spices, and precious metals, began appearing in archaeological contexts at major Slavic settlements, bringing a touch of distant civilizations to the forests of Eastern Europe. The presence of Islamic silver dirhams in Slavic hoards dating to the 8th century provides concrete evidence of the volume and regularity of this trade, and in exchange, Slavic communities provided furs, honey, wax, and slaves to Khazar merchants who transported these goods south to Islamic markets. where they commanded high prices. The influence of Khazar commercial practices extended beyond simple trade relationships to affect the internal organization of Slavic society. For the need to organize and protect valuable trade goods led to the development of more sophisticated political structures within Slavic communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain settlements began specializing in trade-related activity, with evidence of large storage facilities, workshops for processing trade goods, and defensive arrangements designed to protect commercial assets. And these developments laid the groundwork for the emergence of the trading centers that would later become the cities of the Rus state. The Khazar tribute system also played a crucial role in shaping early Slavic political development, as several Slavic tribal confederations, particularly those in the forest steppe regions, came under Khazar suzerainty during the 8th century, and this relationship involved the payment of tribute, typically in the form of furs or silver in exchange for Khazar protection and access to their trade networks. Archaeological evidence from tribute-paying regions shows increased prosperity and the development of more elaborate material culture, suggesting that the benefits of Khazar association outweighed its costs, at least for those communities that could meet their tribute obligation without excessive hardship. The cultural exchange facilitated by Khazar relationship extended beyond commercial practices to include technological innovations and artistic influences, and Khazar metalworking techniques, particularly in silver and bronze, influenced Slavic craftsmen, leading to the development of new decorative style and production methods. Archaeological finds from this period reveal the appearance of belt fittings, jewelry, and other decorative items that combined Slavic motifs with Khazar technical traditions, creating hybrid artistic forms that reflected the cultural mixing that characterized this era of expanding contacts and exchanges. The agricultural development of Slavic communities during the 7th and 8th centuries laid the foundation for their later political and military success. For the fertile soils of the forest steppe region proved ideal for grain cultivation, allowing Slavic communities to generate substantial agricultural surpluses that could support larger populations, fund military expeditions, and attract the attention of traders from distant lands. Archaeological evidence from granary sites reveals storage capacities far exceeding immediate subsistence needs, indicating the development of surplus production for trade and population support. And this agricultural prosperity created the conditions that would attract the attention of Scandinavian traders and warriors, whose arrival in Eastern Europe during the 8th century marked a decisive turning point in the development of what would become the Rus state. The archaeological evidence for Scandinavian presence in Eastern Europe emerges suddenly and dramatically around 750 AD, concentrated initially at strategic river junctions and portage points along the established trade routes connecting the Baltic to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. And the earliest definitive archaeological evidence of Scandinavian settlement appears at Staraya Ladoga, where excavations have revealed a distinct cultural layer dating to approximately 750 to 760 AD containing characteristically Scandinavian artifacts. The site's strategic position at the confluence of the Volkhov River and Lake Ladoga provided ideal conditions for controlling river traffic between the Baltic Sea and the interior waterways, and Swedish archaeologists working at the site have uncovered distinctive Scandinavian-style timber construction techniques, including the use of horizontal log walls with corner notching that differs markedly from contemporary Slavic building methods. The material culture from Staraya Ladoga reveals the presence of a mixed population from its earliest phases, with Scandinavian oval brooches, distinctive sword types with pattern-welded blades, and Thor's hammer pendants appearing alongside Slavic pottery and Finno-Ugric bone tools and ornaments, creating an archaeological assemblage that reflects the multicultural nature of this early trading community. The workshop areas at the site show evidence of specialized craft production, including bead making using imported glass, metalworking facilities for processing both iron and non-ferrous metals, and boat-building areas where Scandinavian shipwrights constructed vessels adapted for river navigation. And the presence of these diverse craft activities indicates a community engaged in both long-distance trade and local production. The cemetery at Starea Ladoga provides crucial insights into the social organization and cultural practices of the early Varangian settlers, and burial practices reveal a complex mixture of Scandinavian and local tradition, with some graves containing distinctively Scandinavian grave goods including weapons, jewelry, and gaming pieces, while others show evidence of local burial customs. The presence of chamber graves constructed using Scandinavian techniques, but containing mixed artifact assemblages, suggests rapid cultural adaptation and intermarriage between Scandinavian settlers and local populations, a pattern that would characterize the development of Rus society throughout its early history. Runic inscriptions found at Starea Ladoga and other early Scandinavian sites in Eastern Europe provide direct textual evidence of Norse presence and activities, and the inscriptions, carved on wooden artifacts, bone implements, and stone surfaces, typically contain personal names, ownership marks, and occasional longer texts describing trading activities or religious invocations. The runic alphabet used in these inscriptions corresponds to the younger Futhark system employed in 9th century Scandinavia, confirming the chronology suggested by archaeological dating methods and providing valuable evidence of the cultural connections that linked the Scandinavian settlers with their homeland across the Baltic Sea. The expansion of Scandinavian presence from Starea Ladoga followed the natural progression of the river trade route southward, and archaeological evidence from Gorodishch, the settlement that preceded medieval Novgorod, reveals Scandinavian cultural material beginning in the late 8th century. The site's position at the northern end of Lake Ilmen made it a crucial control point for traders moving between the Volkhov River system and the portages leading to the Dnieper watershed, and excavations have uncovered evidence of substantial Scandinavian settlement, including distinctive house types, workshop areas, and burial grounds containing characteristically Norse grave goods. The Gnezdovo complex near Smolensk represents perhaps the most significant archaeological evidence for Varangian settlement and activity in Eastern Europe, and the site's enormous cemetery, containing over 3,000 burial mounds, reveals the presence of a substantial and prosperous trading community that flourished from the late 9th through the 10th centuries. The burial practices at Gnezdovo demonstrate the complex cultural synthesis that characterized Varangian settlements, with Scandinavian cremation rituals adapted to local conditions and combined with Slavic and Finno-Ugric burial traditions, creating hybrid funerary practices that reflected the mixed nature of the community. The grave goods from Gnezdovo burials provide extraordinary insight into the material wealth and cultural connections of the Varangian trading communities, and weapons found in the burials include pattern-welded swords of Frankish manufacture, Scandinavian-style axes and spearheads, and archery equipment reflecting both Norse and nomadic steppe traditions. The presence of Islamic silver coins, Byzantine jewelry, and Western European glass beads demonstrates the extensive trade networks controlled by the Gnezdovo community, networks that connected the forests of Eastern Europe with the great civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Islamic world. The establishment of Varangian trading posts followed strategic considerations based on river geography and existing settlement patterns, and the most successful Varangian settlements were positioned at natural bottlenecks in the river systems, where geography forced all traffic to pass through specific points. The Dnieper Rapids south of Kiev created one such choke point, where Varangian traders established seasonal camps to assist merchant expeditions in navigating the treacherous waters, and archaeological evidence from these sites reveals temporary structures designed for processing and protecting trade goods during the dangerous passage. The fortified nature of Varangian settlements reflects both their wealth and their vulnerable position as foreign minorities controlling valuable trade routes, and the defensive arrangements at sites like Gnezdovo included substantial earthen ramparts reinforced with timber palisades and stone foundations. The gates and towers controlling access to these settlements show sophisticated construction techniques, with evidence of specialized military architecture designed to withstand siege warfare, and the presence of weapon caches and the construction of hidden storage facilities within the fortifications indicate the constant threat of attack faced by these communities. The integration of Varangian settlers with established Slavic populations proceeded through multiple mechanisms, ranging from peaceful commercial relationships to violent conquest and subjugation, and archaeological evidence suggests that the initial phase of Varangian settlement was primarily commercial in nature, with Scandinavian traders establishing themselves as intermediaries in existing trade networks, rather than attempting to displace local populations. The material culture from early Varangian sites shows extensive borrowing from local traditions, particularly in pottery production, agricultural tools, and domestic architecture, indicating that the newcomers recognized the value of adapting to local conditions and learning from the peoples among whom they had settled. The linguistic evidence for Varangian Slavic integration appears in the adoption of Scandinavian loanwords into early Slavic dialects, particularly terms related to trade, navigation, and military organization. And archaeological correlates for this linguistic exchange include the appearance of Scandinavian-style scales and weights at Slavic settlements, the adoption of Norse boat-building techniques by Slavic craftsmen, and the integration of Scandinavian decorative motifs into local artistic traditions. Intermarriage between Varangian settlers and local women played a crucial role in the integration process, as evidenced by burial practices that combine elements from multiple cultural traditions, and the cemetery evidence from mixed communities shows the gradual development of hybrid burial customs that incorporated Scandinavian grave goods with Slavic and Finno-Ugric ritual practices. The presence of children's graves containing mixed artifact assemblages suggests that the second generation of Varangian settlers developed cultural identities that blended elements from their Scandinavian heritage with local traditions, creating a new synthesis that was neither purely Scandinavian nor purely Slavic, but something distinctively new. The conflict between Varangian newcomers and established populations is archaeologically visible at several sites, where destruction layers coincide with changes in material culture and settlement patterns, and the fortified Slavic settlement at Sarsko-Gorodishche shows evidence of violent destruction in the late 8th century, followed by reconstruction using Scandinavian building techniques and the appearance of Norse material culture. Similar patterns of destruction and cultural replacement appear at other sites along the Volga trade route, suggesting systematic Varangian conquest of strategic positions. And these episodes of violence remind us that the integration of different peoples was not always peaceful, that the wealth generated by long-distance trade attracted not only merchants, but also warriors seeking to seize control of profitable routes. The military organization of Varangian forces reflected their origins as warrior merchants operating in hostile territory, far from their Scandinavian homelands, and archaeological evidence from weapon deposits and grave goods reveals a military culture based on individual combat prowess and the possession of high-quality weapons and armor. The typical Varangian warrior carried a pattern-welded sword, often of Frankish manufacture, along with a broad-bladed axe, spears, and archery equipment, and the presence of mail armor and metal helmets in wealthy graves indicates the substantial investment required to equip professional warriors. The tactical advantages possessed by Varangian military forces included superior weapons technology, professional training, and mobility provided by their mastery of river navigation, and the Scandinavian tradition of combining seafaring with warfare, translated effectively to the river systems of Eastern Europe, where Varangian forces could move rapidly between widely separated targets while maintaining secure supply lines through their control of waterborne transportation. The archaeological record shows evidence of Varangian military camps positioned at strategic river junctions, designed to control both land and water routes, and these camps served as bases for both commercial operations and military expeditions, allowing the Varangians to project power throughout the river networks of Eastern Europe. The role of Varangian warriors as mercenaries in the service of established Slavic rulers appears in the archaeological record through the presence of Scandinavian weapons and burial practices at major Slavic political centers, and the employment of Varangian military specialists by Slavic princes provided both groups with mutual benefits. The Slavs gained access to superior military technology and professional warriors, while the Varangians secured political protection and commercial privileges, and this relationship is archaeologically visible in the presence of mixed cultural assemblages at elite burial sites, and the construction of fortifications using both Scandinavian and Slavic techniques. The transformation of Varangian military leaders into territorial rulers represents a crucial development in the formation of early Rus political structures, and archaeological evidence from sites like Rurikovo Gorodishchi, near Novgorod, reveals the gradual evolution of Varangian trading posts into permanent political centers. The construction of elaborate residential complexes, the establishment of craft workshops under princely control, and the development of administrative buildings indicate the transition from commercial to political authority, as successful traders and warriors accumulated enough wealth and power to establish themselves as rulers over the territories they had once merely traversed. The administrative capabilities that Varangian rulers brought to their territories included sophisticated record-keeping systems, standardized weights and measures, and established diplomatic protocols for dealing with foreign powers. And archaeological evidence for these administrative innovations includes the appearance of lead seals used for authenticating documents, standardized silver ingots used as currency, and the construction of specialized buildings for conducting official business. The adoption of these Scandinavian administrative practices by Slavic communities facilitated the development of more complex political organizations, creating the institutional foundations upon which the Rus state would be built. The relationship between Varangian rulers and the tribute-paying populations under their control is archaeologically visible through changes in settlement patterns and material culture distribution, and the establishment of Varangian political authority led to the concentration of wealth and craft production at major political centers, while rural settlements show evidence of increased agricultural production to support tribute obligations. The archaeological record reveals the development of specialized craft workshops producing goods specifically for tribute payment, including standardized fur processing facilities and workshops for producing luxury items demanded by foreign trading partners. And these developments indicate the systematic organization of economic activity to support the requirements of the emerging state. The proto-state formations that emerged under Varangian leadership combined Scandinavian military and commercial expertise with Slavic agricultural production and local knowledge of river navigation. And these political entities were characterized by their control over strategic river junctions, their ability to organize long-distance trading expeditions, and their capacity to extract tribute from surrounding agricultural populations. The archaeological evidence for these early states includes the construction of major fortified centers, the establishment of satellite settlements to control territory, and the development of specialized economic activities to support state functions. And these developments laid the groundwork for the emergence of the unified Rus state that would dominate Eastern Europe for centuries to come. The military retinues that formed the core of political power consisted of professional warriors bound to their leaders through personal loyalty and the expectation of sharing in the profits of trading and raiding expeditions. And archaeological evidence from elite burial sites reveals the material culture of these warrior bands, including high-quality weapons, imported luxury goods, and personal ornaments that demonstrated their status and wealth. The burial practices associated with these retinues show the maintenance of Scandinavian traditions, even as the warriors became integrated into local political structures. And the elaborate funerary rituals, including the sacrifice of horses, dogs, and sometimes human servants, reflect the importance placed on honoring fallen warriors and ensuring their comfort in the afterlife. The territorial expansion of Varangian-led political formations followed the logic of river-based transportation and trade route control. And archaeological evidence shows the systematic establishment of fortified positions at key points along major waterways, with each position designed to control river traffic and extract tribute from passing merchants. The spacing and positioning of these fortifications reveals sophisticated strategic planning based on detailed knowledge of river geography and seasonal navigation patterns, and the coordination of multiple fortified positions into integrated defensive and commercial networks indicates the development of political organizations capable of operating across substantial territories. The economic foundation of Varangian political power rested on their control of long-distance trade routes and their ability to organize large-scale commercial expeditions. And archaeological evidence from major Varangian centers reveals the infrastructure necessary to support these trading operations, including large warehouse facilities, workshops for processing trade goods, and shipbuilding areas for constructing and maintaining river vessels. The scale of these facilities indicates commercial operations far exceeding the needs of local consumption, confirming the international scope of Varangian trading activities and the enormous wealth that flowed through their hands. The consolidation of Varangian commercial and military power throughout the river systems of Eastern Europe created the preconditions for the political transformation that would define the emergence of the Rus state, and by the middle of the 9th century, the accumulated wealth from decades of successful trading operations had enabled Varangian leaders to maintain substantial military retinues and establish permanent territorial control over key strategic positions. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals a dramatic shift in settlement patterns, with the construction of larger fortified centers and the development of hierarchical relationships between major strongholds and their dependent territories. And these developments indicate the emergence of political structures that went beyond simple trading posts to encompass territorial governance and the administration of subject populations. The primary chronicles account of the invitation extended to Rurik and his brothers represents one of the most debated narratives in early Rus historiography, and according to the chronicler's version, the Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes of the northern region, specifically the Chud, Slavs, Krivichi, and Vaz, expelled Varangian tribute collectors around 862 AD, but subsequently found themselves unable to maintain order without external authority. The chronicle states that these tribes then sent envoys across the Baltic with the famous invitation: "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." And this narrative, whatever its historical accuracy, became the founding legend of the Rus state, providing legitimacy for the Rurik dynasty that would rule for 7 centuries. The historical accuracy of this narrative has been extensively questioned by modern scholars, who note the chronicle's composition several centuries after the alleged events and its obvious ideological purpose in legitimizing Rurik dynastic claims, and archaeological evidence from the relevant period shows no clear destruction layers that would correspond to the expulsion of Varangian forces, nor is there evidence of the political chaos that the chronicle describes. Instead, the material record suggests a continuity of Varangian presence and gradual consolidation of their authority rather than dramatic rupture and restoration. And this discrepancy between the chronicle narrative and the archaeological evidence has led scholars to view the invitation story as a literary construction rather than a straightforward historical account. The legendary elements of the invitation story become apparent when compared with similar foundation narratives from other medieval societies, for the theme of foreign rulers being invited to restore order appears in numerous Germanic and Celtic traditions, suggesting that the primary chronicle's account may have been influenced by literary conventions rather than historical memory. The specific details of the story, including the threefold division of authority among the brothers, their establishment in different cities, and the subsequent unification under Rurik, follow patterns common to medieval dynastic legends designed to explain complex political developments through simplified narratives that emphasize divine providence and legitimate succession. Archaeological investigation of the sites associated with Rurik's alleged brothers provides little support for the chronicle's account, and Beluzero, where Cineas supposedly established his authority, shows no evidence of major political developments during the 8600s that would correspond to the arrival of a new ruler. Similarly, Izborsk, the alleged seat of Truvor, reveals continuous development throughout the 9th century without the dramatic changes that might be expected from the establishment of new political authority, and the absence of distinctive Scandinavian material culture at these sites during the relevant period suggests that if Varangian rulers did establish themselves there, their presence was either minimal or indistinguishable from existing Scandinavian population. The figure of Rurik himself presents particular historical challenges, as the primary chronicle provides virtually no details about his background, activities, or achievements beyond the basic framework of his invitation and establishment in Novgorod, and some historians have attempted to identify him with Rurik of Dorestad, a Danish Viking leader active in Frisia during the mid-9th century, but this identification remains speculative and is not supported by definitive evidence. The archaeological record from Rurikovo Gorodice, the settlement near Novgorod that bears his name, reveals continuous Scandinavian presence from the early 9th century, but provides no clear evidence for a specific ruler or dramatic political transition in the 8600s. And this ambiguity has led some scholars to question whether Rurik was a historical figure at all, or whether he represents a legendary ancestor created to provide the dynasty with an appropriately ancient and prestigious origin. The establishment of Rurik's rule in Novgorod, as described in the primary chronicle, represents the formalization of Varangian political authority that had been developing gradually throughout the first half of the 9th century. And archaeological evidence from Rurikovo Gorodice reveals substantial construction activity during this period, including the expansion of defensive fortifications and the construction of large residential complexes that suggest the presence of a significant ruling elite. The site's strategic position at the northern end of Lake Ilmen provided control over the crucial water routes connecting the Baltic trade networks with the interior river systems, and whoever controlled this position could regulate the flow of goods and people between Scandinavia and the wealthy markets of the south. The material culture from Rurikovo Gorodice during the mid-9th century demonstrates the cosmopolitan nature of the emerging Rus political center, and excavations have uncovered artifacts from across the known world, including Islamic silver coins, Byzantine silk textiles, Frankish weapons, and amber from the Baltic shores. The presence of specialized workshops for metalworking, bead production, and textile manufacture indicates the concentration of skilled craftsmen under princely patronage. and the scale and sophistication of these workshop operations suggest production levels far exceeding local consumption, confirming the site's role as a major center for long-distance trade. The founding of the Rurik dynasty, whether historical or legendary, established the political framework that would govern the Rus territories for the next 7 centuries, and the dynastic principle introduced by the Varangian rulers differed significantly from the tribal leadership structures that had previously characterized Slavic political organization. Instead of authority based on kinship ties within local communities or temporary military leadership, the Rurik system established hereditary rule transmitted through patrilineal descent, and this innovation provided political stability and continuity that enabled the development of more complex state structures. Archaeological evidence for the implementation of dynastic authority appears in the construction of permanent royal residences and the establishment of administrative centers throughout Varangian-controlled territories, and the fortified complexes at major centers like Gnezdovo, Sarsku Gorodiche, and Chestovitz reveal architectural features designed to house ruling elites and their retinues on a permanent basis. These structures included large halls for ceremonial gatherings, private residential quarters for the ruling family, and storage facilities for tribute collection and redistribution. And the standardization of these architectural features across multiple sites indicates the development of common concepts of royal authority and its material expression. The administrative innovations introduced by the Rurik dynasty drew upon Scandinavian traditions of royal governance, while adapting to the specific conditions of Eastern European river-based territories, and the archaeological record reveals the development of standardized weights and measures, the establishment of regular tribute collection systems, and the creation of permanent military garrisons at strategic locations. Lead seals bearing runic inscriptions provide evidence for the development of documentary administration, while the distribution of standardized silver ingots suggests the implementation of regular taxation and payment systems. And these administrative innovations created the institutional foundations upon which the Rus state would be built. Archaeological evidence supporting the emergence of centralized authority in key trading settlements becomes particularly visible during the second half of the 9th century, and the construction of monumental earthwork fortifications at sites like Gnezdovo required the coordination of substantial labor forces and the investment of significant resources in non-productive activities. The scale of these undertakings indicates the presence of political authorities capable of organizing large-scale public works projects and commanding the loyalty or obedience of substantial population. And the standardization of construction techniques across multiple sites suggests the development of common engineering knowledge and coordinated planning. The cemetery evidence from major trading centers reveals the emergence of distinct social hierarchies that correspond to the development of centralized political authority, and the burial practices at Gnezdovo show clear differentiation between elite graves containing elaborate weapon sets, imported luxury goods, and evidence of human sacrifice, and simpler burials reflecting the material culture of dependent population. The most elaborate burials include chamber graves constructed using Scandinavian techniques but containing artifact assemblages that reflect the cosmopolitan nature of Rus elite culture, combining Scandinavian, Slavic, Byzantine, and Islamic elements into distinctive expressions of wealth and status. The distribution of Islamic silver coins throughout the territories under Rurik control provides quantitative evidence for the expansion and intensification of centralized authority, and hoards dating to the late 9th century show dramatic increases in the volume of silver circulating through the region, indicating the success of the new political structures in organizing and protecting long-distance trade. The standardization of coin weights and the evidence for systematic clipping and testing of silver quality suggest the development of sophisticated monetary systems under princely control, and these developments indicate the emergence of economic institutions capable of supporting complex commercial and administrative activities. The fortification systems that emerged during this period reveal the military capabilities that supported centralized authority, and the defensive arrangements at Rurik included multiple lines of earthen ramparts, reinforced with timber palisades and stone foundation. The gates controlling access to the settlement featured complex entrance systems designed to channel attackers through killing zones while providing defenders with protected firing positions, and the construction techniques employed in these fortifications demonstrate knowledge of advanced military engineering principles derived from both Scandinavian and Byzantine traditions. The synthesis of Scandinavian military organization with Slavic administrative traditions created distinctive institutional forms that characterized early Rus governance, and the Varangian tradition of warrior bands bound to their leaders through personal loyalty was adapted to incorporate Slavic concepts of territorial authority and tribute collection from agricultural population. Archaeological evidence for this synthesis appears in the construction of fortified administrative centers that combined military functions with civilian governance, storage facilities for tribute collection, and workshops for producing goods needed for state functions. And these hybrid institutions provided the organizational framework for the emerging Rus state. The death of Rurik around 879 AD precipitated a succession crisis that would ultimately reshape the political landscape of Eastern Europe and establish the foundations for the unified Rus state. And with Rurik's son Igor, still a minor, authority passed to Oleg, identified in the primary chronicle as Rurik's kinsman and military commander. Archaeological evidence from Rurikovo Gorodische reveals significant construction activity during this transition period, including the expansion of defensive fortifications and the establishment of new administrative buildings that suggest preparations for major political and military undertakings. And these developments indicate that Oleg recognized the need to consolidate his position before embarking on the ambitious campaigns that would define his reign. Oleg's assumption of regency marked a decisive shift from the relatively localized authority exercised by earlier Varangian rulers to a systematic program of territorial expansion and political consolidation. And the archaeological record from sites throughout the northern river systems shows evidence of increased military activity during the early AD 800s, including the construction of fortified positions at strategic river junctions and the establishment of supply depots designed to support extended military campaigns. The scale of these preparations indicates planning for operations far more ambitious than the localist conflicts that had characterized earlier Varangian expansion, and the coordination of resources from multiple centers suggests the development of administrative capabilities that could mobilize the entire northern Rus territory for major military undertakings. The strategic vision that drove Oleg's southern expansion reflected a sophisticated understanding of the economic and political opportunities presented by control over the entire route from the Varangians to the Greeks. And archaeological evidence from trading centers along this route reveals the enormous wealth generated by commerce between the Baltic region and the Byzantine Empire, with Islamic silver, Byzantine luxury goods, and northern furs flowing through established networks that connected Scandinavia to Constantinople and the Islamic world. The concentration of this wealth at key river junctions made control over these positions enormously valuable to any ruler capable of seizing and maintaining them, and Oleg recognized that unifying the northern and southern portions of this trade route under a single political authority would create unprecedented opportunities for wealth accumulation and power projection. The military preparations for Oleg's southern campaign involved the mobilization of forces from across the northern Rus territories, and archaeological evidence from weapon deposits and burial sites dating to this period reveals the assembly of substantial military forces equipped with standardized weapons and armor. The grave goods from elite warrior burials show the presence of professional military specialists armed with pattern-welded swords, broad-bladed axes, and mail armor that represented significant investments in military equipment. And the standardization of weapon types and the evidence for centralized production of military equipment indicates systematic preparation for large-scale warfare. The expedition that culminated in the conquest of Kiev began with the systematic reduction of fortified positions along the Dnieper route, and archaeological evidence from sites like Gnezdovo reveals signs of military activity during the early 88 HOAs, including destruction layers that correspond to the period of Oleg's southern advance. The reconstruction of these sites following their capture shows the implementation of standardized fortification designs and administrative arrangements that reflect centralized political control rather than local autonomy. And this pattern of destruction and reconstruction indicates Oleg's determination to establish direct control over the entire trade route rather than simply extracting tribute from autonomous local rulers. The approach to Kiev required careful coordination of both land and river-based forces, as the city's position on the high western bank of the Dnieper provided natural defensive advantages that could not be overcome through simple assault. And archaeological investigation of the approaches to Kiev reveals evidence of temporary military camps positioned to control river traffic while maintaining secure supply lines to the north. The placement of these camps demonstrates sophisticated military planning that took into account both the seasonal variations in river levels and the defensive capabilities of the target city. And the coordination of multiple military columns suggests the development of command and control capabilities that went beyond traditional Varangian raiding tactics. The primary chronicles account of Oleg's deception in capturing Kiev describes how he concealed his warriors in boats and presented himself as a peaceful merchant before revealing his true identity and overwhelming the city's defenders. And while the specific details of this narrative may reflect literary embellishment, archaeological evidence supports the general picture of a carefully planned operation that achieved surprise through the use of disguised forces. The absence of extensive destruction layers at Kiev suggests that the city's capture was accomplished through stratagem rather than prolonged siege warfare, and this outcome would have preserved the economic infrastructure that made Kiev valuable, while minimizing the costs of conquest. The elimination of Askold and Deir, the Varangian rulers who had controlled Kiev since the 86 OF, represented more than simple political assassination, but rather the systematic removal of rivals to Rurik authority. And archaeological evidence from elite burial sites in the Kiev region shows a marked change in burial practices following Oleg's conquest, with the disappearance of certain types of Scandinavian grave goods and their replacement by artifact assemblages that reflect the material culture of the northern Rus territories. This pattern suggests a comprehensive replacement of the existing political elite, rather than simple incorporation into Oleg's power structure. And the thoroughness of this replacement indicates Oleg's determination to establish unchallenged authority over the conquered territories. The establishment of Kiev as Oleg's primary residence and the administrative center of the expanded Rus state required substantial modifications to the city's infrastructure and defensive arrangements, and archaeological excavations in the historical center of Kiev reveal extensive construction activity dating to the late 9th century, including the expansion of fortifications, the construction of large residential complexes for the ruling elite, and the establishment of workshop areas for craft production under princely control. The scale of these undertakings indicates the commitment of substantial resources to transforming Kiev into a capital worthy of a major territorial power, and the architectural sophistication of the new construction reflects the influence of both Scandinavian and Byzantine building traditions. The strategic importance of controlling both Novgorod and Kiev lay in their positions at opposite ends of the most lucrative trade route in Eastern Europe. And archaeological evidence from both cities reveals the enormous wealth that flowed through this commercial network, with finds including Islamic silver coins, Byzantine silk textiles, precious stones from Central Asia, and amber from the Baltic shores. The volume of luxury goods present at these sites far exceeds what could be supported by local production, confirming their roles as major international trading centers whose control provided access to unprecedented wealth. The military campaigns that followed the conquest of Kiev were designed to establish tributary relationships with the various Slavic tribes whose territories flanked the Dnieper trade route. And archaeological evidence from tribal territories shows signs of military pressure during this period, including the construction of new fortifications and the presence of weapon deposits that suggest preparation for conflict. The material culture from these sites reveals the gradual adoption of Rus administrative practices and the appearance of goods that indicate participation in the expanded trade networks controlled by Oleg's forces. And these developments suggest that most tribal confederations chose to accept tributary status rather than risk military confrontation with the unified Rus state. The subjugation of the Drevlian required sustained military pressure against a population whose forest territories provided natural defensive advantages, and archaeological evidence from Drevlian settlements reveals signs of systematic destruction followed by reconstruction under Rus supervision. The establishment of fortified administrative centers in Drevlian territory provided basis for tribute collection and the suppression of resistance movements, and the tribute obligations imposed on the Drevlian included furs, honey, and wax, products that were essential components of the international trade networks that formed the economic foundation of Rus power. The incorporation of the Severian into Oleg's tributary system required different tactics, as their territories along the Desna and Seym rivers provided alternative routes that could be used to bypass Rus control over the main Dnieper route. And archaeological evidence from Severian settlements shows the establishment of Rus administrative presence at key river junctions, with fortified positions designed to monitor and control river traffic. The tribute arrangements with the Severian included both traditional forest products and agricultural surplus, reflecting the mixed economy of the forest steppe region they inhabited. And the integration of Severian territories into the Rus state provided both economic resources and strategic depth that enhanced the security of the core territories along the Dnieper. The campaign against the Radimichi demonstrated Oleg's systematic approach to eliminating alternative sources of political authority that might challenge Rus control over tributary populations. And the Radimichi had previously paid tribute to the Khazars, and their incorporation into the Rus system required the displacement of Khazar influence from territories that had been under their control for several generations. Archaeological evidence from Radimichi territory reveals the destruction of Khazar-affiliated trading posts and their replacement by fortifications built using Rus construction techniques. And this pattern indicates Oleg's determination to establish exclusive control over the tribute-paying populations of Eastern Europe. The confrontation with Khazar authority represented a major escalation in the scope of Oleg's territorial ambitions, as the Khazar Khaganate remained a formidable military and political power, with extensive resources and established diplomatic relationships throughout the region. And archaeological evidence from the border regions between Rus and Khazar territories reveals the construction of substantial fortifications designed to withstand attacks by nomadic cavalry forces. The defensive arrangements at these sites include features specifically adapted to counter-steppe warfare tactics, including multiple lines of earthen ramparts and obstacles designed to disrupt cavalry charges. And these preparations indicate that Oleg recognized the potential for military conflict with the Khazars, even as he sought to expand Rus' influence into territories they had previously controlled. The tribute systems established by Oleg throughout the conquered territories represented a sophisticated administrative achievement that required the coordination of collection procedures across vast distances and diverse population. And archaeological evidence reveals the standardization of tribute assessment methods, with uniform procedures for measuring and evaluating different types of goods. The establishment of regular collection schedules and the construction of storage facilities at strategic locations provided the infrastructure necessary for systematic extraction and transportation of tribute goods to major trading centers. And these administrative innovations created the institutional foundations for the Rus state's economic system. The administrative innovations implemented during Oleg's reign included the appointment of governors to oversee tributary territories and the establishment of permanent garrisons to enforce compliance with tribute obligation. And archaeological evidence from administrative centers reveals the construction of specialized buildings for housing appointed officials and their retinues, along with facilities for storing and processing tribute goods. The standardization of administrative practices across these centers indicates the development of systematic governance procedures that could be implemented consistently throughout the expanded Rus territories, and these innovations represented a significant advance in governmental sophistication that enhanced the effectiveness of central authority. The expedition against Constantinople in 907 AD represented the culmination of Oleg's territorial expansion and the demonstration of Rus emergence as a major regional power capable of threatening the Byzantine Empire itself. And archaeological evidence from sites along the Dnieper route reveals extensive preparations for this campaign, including the construction of naval bases and the assembly of materials for building the fleet that would transport Rus forces to the walls of Constantinople. The scale of these preparations indicates a massive undertaking that involved the mobilization of resources from throughout the Rus territories, and the coordination of such an extensive operation demonstrates the administrative capabilities that had developed under Oleg's leadership. The logistics of transporting a substantial military force from Kiev to Constantinople required careful coordination of both river and maritime navigation, as the expedition had to traverse the Dnieper rapids, cross the Black Sea, and approach the heavily fortified Byzantine capital. And archaeological evidence from temporary camps along the route reveals the infrastructure necessary to support such an undertaking, including facilities for repairing and maintaining vessels, supply depots for storing provisions, and defensive positions to protect the expedition from attacks by hostile populations along the route. The siege of Constantinople demonstrated Rus' adoption of advanced military techniques that went far beyond traditional Varangian raiding tactics, and the primary chronicle's description of Oleg's forces placing their ships on wheels and sailing across land to bypass the chain blocking the Golden Horn, while possibly embellished, reflects the innovative approaches employed by Rus military engineers. Archaeological evidence from Byzantine sources confirms that the 907 expedition posed a serious threat to the capital and forced the imperial government to negotiate rather than risk a prolonged siege. And the success of this expedition established the Rus state as a power that could not be ignored by the Byzantine Empire. The peace treaty negotiated between Oleg and the Byzantine Emperor Leo VI established a framework for regular commercial and diplomatic relationships between the Rus and the Byzantine Empire, and archaeological evidence from trading centers along the Dnieper route shows dramatic increases in the volume of Byzantine goods following the conclusion of this agreement, indicating the success of Oleg's military pressure in opening new commercial opportunities. The treaty provisions included guarantees of safe passage for Rus merchants, standardized procedures for commercial transactions, and diplomatic protocols for resolving disputes. And these arrangements created the institutional framework for the profitable trade relationships that would sustain the Rus state for generations. The death of Oleg in 912 AD marked the end of the great expansion phase that had unified the northern and southern Rus territories under a single political authority, and archaeological evidence from Kiev reveals elaborate burial preparations during this period, including the construction of substantial funeral monuments that reflect the accumulated wealth and prestige of the Rus state under Oleg's leadership. The transition of power to Igor, Rurik's son, who had finally reached maturity, represented both continuity with the established Rurik dynasty and the beginning of new challenges that would test the administrative and military structures created during the previous generation. Igor's assumption of full ruling authority coincided with the emergence of complex problems that stemmed directly from the success of Oleg's conquests. For the vast territorial expanse, now under Rus control, stretched from the Baltic shores to the Black Sea steppes, encompassing diverse populations with different languages, customs, and economic systems. Archaeological evidence from administrative centers throughout this territory reveals the strain placed on existing governance structures by the sheer scale of the territories requiring supervision and coordination, and the standardized administrative procedures that had worked effectively during the conquest phase proved inadequate for the long-term management of such extensive and diverse holdings. The challenge of maintaining control over tributary populations became particularly acute as the initial shock of conquest faded, and local populations began to reassess their relationships with their Rus overlords. And archaeological evidence from tribal territories reveals increasing signs of fortification construction and weapon accumulation during the early years of Igor's reign, suggesting growing resistance to continued tribute obligation. The material culture from these sites shows attempts to reduce dependence on Rus-controlled trade networks through the development of alternative commercial relationships and local craft production. And these developments indicate that tributary populations were seeking ways to limit their subordination to Rus authority. The Drevlian territories presented the most persistent challenge to Igor's authority, as their forest environment provided natural defensive advantages while their traditional economy based on hunting, beekeeping, and limited agriculture generated surplus products that were essential to Rus trade networks. Archaeological excavations at Drevlian settlements reveal evidence of systematic efforts to evade tribute obligation, including the concealment of valuable goods in hidden storage pits and the development of alternative trading relationships that bypassed Rus commercial networks. And the discovery of weapon caches at multiple Drevlian sites indicates preparation for armed resistance to continued tributary status. The economic pressures that drove Igor's increasingly aggressive tribute collection policies stemmed from the enormous costs of maintaining the military and administrative apparatus necessary to control the expanded Rus territories, and archaeological evidence from major centers reveals the substantial resources required to support professional military units, maintain fortifications, and fund the diplomatic and commercial activities that sustained relationships with Byzantium and other foreign powers. The scale of these expenditures created constant pressure for increased revenue extraction from tributary populations, and the tension between the state's financial needs and the productive capacity of tributary communities would ultimately prove fatal for Igor himself. The tribute collection system that developed during Igor's reign involved the annual circuit known as polyuti, during which the prince and his retinue would travel throughout the tributary territories to collect payments in kind and adjudicate disputes. And archaeological evidence from sites along these collection routes reveals the substantial logistical infrastructure required to support these expeditions, including seasonal camps equipped with storage facilities for accumulating tribute goods, defensive positions for protecting valuable collections, and administrative buildings where disputes could be heard and judgments rendered according to established custom and princely authority. The polyuti circuit followed predictable routes that had been established through generations of practice, moving through tributary territories in sequences determined by seasonal accessibility and the agricultural cycles that govern the availability of different tribute goods. And the material culture from these collection sites reveals the enormous quantities of diverse products that flowed through this system, including furs of various types carefully sorted by quality and species, honey and wax collected from forest beekeeping operations, grain and other agricultural products from the fertile Black Earth regions, and craft goods produced by specialized artisans working under princely supervision or tributary obligation. The administrative personnel who accompanied the prince on these collection circuits included specialized officials responsible for assessing tribute obligations, recording payments, and maintaining the accounts that enabled central authorities to track compliance across vast territorial expanses, and archaeological evidence from administrative sites reveals the development of sophisticated record-keeping systems, including the use of tally sticks, knotted cords, and eventually written documents that provided permanent records of tribute assessments and payments that could be referenced in subsequent years to ensure consistent treatment of tributary populations. The judicial functions that accompanied tribute collection represented an essential component of princely authority, as the annual circuit provided the primary opportunity for tributary populations to bring disputes before princely judgment and receive authoritative resolution of conflicts that could not be settled through local mechanisms. And the material culture from judicial sites includes evidence of ceremonial objects used in oath-taking procedures, standardized weights and measures for assessing compensation payments, and specialized facilities for conducting formal legal proceedings that demonstrated the dignity and authority of princely justice. The military escort that protected tribute collection expeditions consisted of professional warriors whose presence served both practical security functions and symbolic demonstrations of princely power that reinforced the authority underlying tribute obligations. And archaeological evidence from military encampments along collection routes reveals the substantial forces involved in these operations, including cavalry units capable of rapid response to threats, infantry formations for defending fixed positions, and specialized personnel for managing the logistics of moving large quantities of valuable goods across potentially hostile territory. The relationship between tribute collection and commercial activity created complex economic dynamics, as the goods collected through the Polyudi system formed the foundation of international trade that generated additional revenues for princely treasuries while also creating opportunities for private commercial activity by members of the princely retinue and local populations who participated in the collection and transportation processes. And the material culture from trading centers reveals the integration of tribute goods into broader commercial networks that connected the Rus territories with markets throughout the known world. The seasonal rhythm of tribute collection shaped the annual cycle of governmental activity, with the winter months devoted to the Polyudi circuit, when frozen rivers and snow-covered ground facilitated transportation of heavy goods, while summer months were reserved for military campaigns, diplomatic activities, and the commercial expeditions that converted tribute goods into the silver and luxury items that sustained elite consumption and international prestige. And archaeological evidence from seasonal sites reveals the specialized facilities developed for different phases of this annual cycle. The burden of hosting princely collection expeditions fell heavily on tributary communities, who were obligated to provide not only the assessed tribute payments, but also food, shelter, and transportation services for the prince and his substantial retinue during their residence in local territories. And the material culture from hosting sites reveals the construction of specialized facilities for accommodating princely visits, including large halls for ceremonial gatherings, storage buildings for tribute goods, and defensive arrangements for protecting valuable collections during the period of local accumulation. The tensions inherent in the tribute collection system became increasingly acute as the costs of maintaining the military and administrative apparatus continued to grow, while the productive capacity of tributary populations remained relatively stable, creating pressure for increased extraction that eventually exceeded the tolerance of subject peoples and contributed to the resistance movements that would culminate in Igor's death and the subsequent crisis of Rus authority. The death of Igor in the forests of the Drevlian lands created a profound crisis for the young Rus state, one that threatened to unravel the careful work of political consolidation that had occupied the previous generations of Rurik rulers. The circumstances of Igor's death, killed by a tributary population that had grown weary of excessive demands, exposed the fundamental fragility of the tribute-based political economy that sustained Varangian authority over the diverse peoples of Eastern Europe. The Drevliane, emboldened by their successful resistance, sent envoys to Kiev with a proposal that Princess Olga, Igor's widow, should marry their Prince Mal, thereby legitimizing Drevlian independence and potentially establishing a new political order in the region. This proposal, recorded in the primary chronicle with considerable dramatic embellishment, represented a direct challenge to Rurik authority and the principle of dynastic succession that had begun to take root in Rus political culture. Olga's response to this crisis demonstrated a combination of political cunning, ruthless determination, and strategic vision that would establish her as one of the most remarkable figures in early Rus history. The chronicle accounts of her revenge against the Drevliane, while certainly containing legendary elements, preserve the memory of a systematic campaign of retribution that served both practical and symbolic purposes. The famous episodes of the buried envoys, the bathhouse massacre, and the funeral feast slaughter, whatever their historical accuracy, conveyed a clear message about the consequences of challenging Rurik authority. The final destruction of the Drevlian capital, Iskarostan, through the legendary stratagem of the sparrows and pigeons carrying burning materials, represented the complete subjugation of this rebellious population and the restoration of Rus authority over the Middle Dnieper region. Beyond the immediate military and political objectives, Olga's campaign against the Drevliane served to establish her authority as regent for her young son Sviatoslav, and to demonstrate that the Rus state could survive the death of its ruler without collapsing into chaos. The successful prosecution of this punitive expedition required the mobilization of military resources, the coordination of logistics across considerable distances, and the maintenance of loyalty among the diverse elements of the Rus military establishment. Olga's ability to accomplish these tasks in the immediate aftermath of her husband's death testified to her political skills and to the institutional foundations that had been established during the previous decades of Rurik rule. The administrative reforms attributed to Olga's regency represented a fundamental transformation in the relationship between the Rus state and its tributary populations. The chronicle tradition credits Olga with establishing fixed tribute obligations and designated collection points throughout the Rus territories, replacing the more arbitrary and potentially exploitative polyuti system that had contributed to Igor's death. These reforms, known as the establishment of pogosti and uroki, created a more predictable and sustainable framework for extracting resources from subject populations, while reducing the opportunities for the kind of excessive demands that had provoked the Drevlian revolt. The pogosti system established a network of administrative centers throughout the Rus territories, each serving as a designated location for tribute collection and the exercise of princely authority. These centers, strategically located along major waterways and trade routes, provided the infrastructure for more systematic governance, while reducing the need for the annual princely progresses that had characterized earlier tribute collection practices. Archaeological evidence from sites identified as early pogosti reveals the construction of fortified compounds, storage facilities, and administrative buildings that supported the functions of these new institutions. The material culture from these sites demonstrates the presence of princely representatives and the conduct of commercial and judicial activities that extended Rus authority into previously peripheral regions. The uroki, or fixed tribute assessments, established predictable obligations for each tributary community based on their population, resources, and economic capacity. This systematization of tribute requirements reduced the arbitrary nature of earlier extraction practices and provided tributary populations with greater certainty about their obligations to the Rus state. The establishment of fixed assessments also facilitated more effective planning and resource allocation by the central authorities, who could now anticipate their revenues with greater accuracy. The administrative records necessary for maintaining such a system, while not surviving in their original form, are reflected in later documentary traditions that preserve information about tribute obligations and administrative boundaries. Olga's diplomatic initiatives extended the international recognition of the Rus state and established precedents for the conduct of foreign relations that would influence subsequent generations. Her famous visit to Constantinople, recorded in both Rus and Byzantine sources, represented a significant diplomatic achievement that brought the Rus princess into direct contact with the most sophisticated court in the Christian world. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine the Seventh Porphyrogenetos, whose own writings provide valuable information about the Rus, received Olga with considerable ceremony, though the precise nature of the diplomatic agreements reached during this visit remains a matter of scholarly debate. The most significant aspect of Olga's Constantinople visit was her acceptance of Christian baptism, an event that marked the first conversion of a member of the Rurik dynasty to the faith that would eventually become the official religion of the Rus state. The circumstances and motivations of Olga's conversion have been extensively debated by historians, with some emphasizing personal spiritual conviction and others highlighting the political and diplomatic advantages of establishing closer ties with the Byzantine Empire. Whatever her personal motivations, Olga's baptism created a precedent for the eventual Christianization of Rus and established connections with Byzantine ecclesiastical authorities that would prove significant in subsequent decades. The Byzantine sources provide additional details about Olga's visit that complement and sometimes contradict the Rus chronicle accounts. Constantine VII's own ceremonial handbook, the De Ceremoniis, includes a description of the reception accorded to the Rus princess that reveals both the honor shown to this important visitor and the careful protocol that governed Byzantine diplomatic practice. The gifts exchanged during the visit, the seating arrangements at imperial banquets, and the access granted to various parts of the palace complex all conveyed messages about the relative status of the Rus state in the Byzantine diplomatic hierarchy. The discrepancies between the Rus and Byzantine accounts of this visit reflect the different perspectives and purposes of these sources, with each tradition emphasizing aspects of the encounter that served its own narrative objectives. Olga's efforts to promote Christianity within the Rus lands met with limited success during her lifetime, as the pagan traditions of the Varangian military elite and the Slavic population remained deeply rooted. Her son Sviatoslav, who assumed active rule as he came of age, explicitly rejected his mother's faith and maintained the traditional religious practices of his warrior companions. The chronicle tradition preserves Sviatoslav's famous response to his mother's urgings that he accept baptism, noting that his retinue would laugh at him if he adopted a foreign religion. This resistance to Christianity among the military elite reflected the close association between traditional religious practices and warrior identity, an association that would only be overcome through the determined efforts of Sviatoslav's son Vladimir in the following generation. The economic developments during Olga's regency reflected the continued growth and diversification of the Rus economy. The administrative reforms that systematized tribute collection also facilitated the expansion of commercial activities by providing greater security and predictability for merchants operating within the Rus territories. The establishment of pogosti along major trade routes created nodes of commercial activity where local products could be exchanged and where long-distance traders could find the services and supplies necessary for their journeys. Archaeological evidence from these sites reveals the presence of imported goods, craft production facilities, and the material indicators of commercial prosperity. The relationship between the Rus state and the Byzantine Empire during Olga's regency was characterized by both cooperation and tension. The diplomatic achievements of Olga's Constantinople visit were followed by periods of strained relations, as the interests of the two powers did not always coincide. The Rus' desire for favorable trading privileges and recognition of their growing power sometimes conflicted with Byzantine efforts to maintain their traditional dominance over the Black Sea region and to manage the various peoples along their northern frontier. The military capabilities demonstrated by earlier Rus expeditions against Constantinople ensured that Byzantine diplomacy toward the Rus was conducted with appropriate respect for this potentially dangerous neighbor. The internal political dynamics of the Rus state during Olga's regency reflected the ongoing process of institutional development and the gradual emergence of more sophisticated governmental structures. The Boyar Council, composed of the leading members of the military and administrative elite, played an increasingly important role in advising the ruler and participating in major decisions. The chronicle accounts of Olga's reign include references to consultation with advisors and the involvement of prominent individuals in diplomatic and military undertakings. These references suggest the development of more formalized decision-making processes, even as ultimate authority remained concentrated in the hands of the Rurikid ruler. The transition from Olga's regency to Sviatoslav's active rule marked a significant shift in the orientation and priorities of the Rus state. While Olga had focused on administrative consolidation, diplomatic engagement, and the gradual introduction of Christian influences, Sviatoslav would pursue a dramatically different agenda centered on military expansion and the assertion of Rus power across a vast geographical area. The contrast between mother and son in the chronicle tradition serves to highlight the different paths available to the Rus state at this critical juncture in its development, with Olga representing the possibilities of peaceful development and integration into the Christian Commonwealth, while Sviatoslav embodied the warrior traditions and expansionist ambitions of the Varangian heritage. The reign of Sviatoslav Igorovich represented the most dramatic phase of military expansion in early Rus history, a period during which Rus armies campaigned across vast distances and challenged the established powers of Eastern Europe and the Near East. Sviatoslav's character, as portrayed in the chronicle tradition, embodied the ideal of the Varangian warrior prince, a leader who shared the hardships of campaign life with his followers and who sought glory through military achievement rather than the comforts of settled rule. The famous description of Sviatoslav's austere lifestyle, sleeping on the ground with a saddle for a pillow and eating only roasted meat, conveyed an image of martial simplicity that contrasted sharply with the more sophisticated court culture that was developing in Kiev under Byzantine influence. The first major campaign of Sviatoslav's reign targeted the Khazar Khaganate, the great power that had dominated the steppe regions of Eastern Europe for centuries, and that had long collected tribute from various Slavic populations. The Khazar state, though past its peak of power, still controlled important trade routes and maintained significant military capabilities. Sviatoslav's campaign against the Khazars, conducted around 965 AD, resulted in the destruction of the major Khazar centers and the effective elimination of Khazar power as a significant factor in Eastern European politics. The capture and destruction of the Khazar capital Itil, located near the mouth of the Volga River, and the fortress of Sarkel on the Don River, demonstrated the reach and effectiveness of Rus' military power. The consequences of the Khazar collapse extended far beyond the immediate military and political results of Sviatoslav's campaign. The Khazar Khaganate had served as a buffer between the settled populations of Eastern Europe and the nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppes, and its destruction opened the way for new waves of nomadic migration that would profoundly affect the subsequent history of the region. The Pechenegs, who had already been pressing against Khazar territories, expanded into the vacuum created by the Khaganate's collapse, establishing themselves as the dominant power in the steppe regions and posing new challenges for the Rus state. The long-term implications of Sviatoslav's Khazar campaign thus included both the immediate expansion of Rus influence and the creation of new security challenges that would occupy his successors for generations. The eastern campaigns of Sviatoslav also brought Rus forces into contact with the peoples of the Volga region, including the Volga Bulgars, whose commercial center at Bulgar had long been an important node in the trade networks connecting Northern Europe with the Islamic world. The Rus attack on Bulgar disrupted these commercial relationships and demonstrated the vulnerability of even well-established trading centers to military assault. The archaeological evidence from Bulgar and other sites in the Volga region reveals the impact of these campaigns on local populations and the disruption of commercial activities that had flourished for centuries. Following the successful conclusion of his eastern campaigns, Sviatoslav turned his attention to the Balkans, where the declining Byzantine Empire faced challenges from the Bulgarian state that had long contested Byzantine dominance in the region. The Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros, the second Phocas, seeking to use the Rus as a tool against the Bulgarians, invited Sviatoslav to intervene in Balkan affairs, offering substantial payments for Rus military assistance. This invitation, which the Byzantines would come to regret, brought Rus forces into direct involvement in the complex politics of the Balkans and initiated a period of intense military activity that would ultimately threaten Byzantine interests as much as Bulgarian. Sviatoslav's Balkan campaigns, beginning around 967 AD, demonstrated both the military capabilities of the Rus forces and the ambitious scope of their leader's vision. The initial campaign against the Bulgarians achieved rapid success, with Rus forces capturing numerous Bulgarian cities and establishing control over significant portions of Bulgarian territory. Sviatoslav's decision to establish his capital at Pereyaslavice on the Danube, rather than returning to Kiev, revealed his intention to create a new center of power in the Balkans, one that would control the lucrative trade routes connecting the Black Sea with Central Europe and the Mediterranean. The chronicle tradition preserves Sviatoslav's famous declaration that Pereyaslavice represented the center of his realm, where all good things converged: gold, silks, wine, and various fruits from Greece, silver and horses from Hungary and Bohemia, furs, wax, honey, and slaves from Rus. This vision of a Danubian empire controlling the intersection of major trade routes represented a dramatic departure from the traditional orientation of Rus power toward the river routes connecting the Baltic with the Black Sea. Had Sviatoslav succeeded in establishing permanent control over the Balkans, the subsequent history of Eastern Europe might have developed along very different lines. The Byzantine response to Sviatoslav's Balkan ambitions demonstrated the continued military and diplomatic capabilities of the empire, even during a period of internal difficulties. The new emperor, John I Tzimiskis, who had seized power through the assassination of Nicephorus II, mobilized substantial military resources to confront the Rus threat. The Byzantine campaigns against Sviatoslav, conducted with the full weight of imperial military power, gradually pushed the Rus forces back from their Balkan conquests. The siege of Dorostalon, Dristra, in 971 AD represented the climactic confrontation between Rus and Byzantine forces, a prolonged engagement that tested the endurance and military skills of both sides. The accounts of the Dorostalon siege, preserved in both Byzantine and Rus sources, provide detailed information about the military tactics and equipment employed by both armies. The Byzantine sources describe the fierce resistance of the Rus warriors, their distinctive appearance and equipment, and the heavy casualties suffered by both sides during the extended siege. The Rus chronicle tradition emphasizes the heroic resistance of Sviatoslav's forces and the honorable terms eventually negotiated for their withdrawal. The famous meeting between Sviatoslav and John Tzimiskes on the Danube, described in detail by Byzantine historians, provides a vivid portrait of the Rus prince at the height of his military career, even in the moment of his strategic defeat. The terms negotiated at Dorostalon required Sviatoslav to withdraw from the Balkans and to renounce his claims to Bulgarian territory. In exchange, the Rus forces were permitted to depart with their arms and equipment, and commercial relations between Rus and Byzantium were to be restored. The treaty represented a significant setback for Sviatoslav's ambitious plans, though it preserved the core of his military forces and maintained the possibility of future Rus involvement in Balkan affairs. The Byzantine victory at Dorostalon demonstrated the continued effectiveness of imperial military power and established limits on Rus expansion toward the south and west. Sviatoslav's return journey from the Balkans ended in disaster at the Dnieper Rapids, where Pecheneg forces ambushed and destroyed the Rus army. Sviatoslav himself was killed in this engagement, and according to later tradition, the Pecheneg Khan Kuria had the Rus prince's skull made into a drinking cup. This ignominious end to one of the most ambitious military careers in early Rus history illustrated the dangers posed by the nomadic peoples of the steppe, and the vulnerability of even the most successful military leaders to the hazards of travel through contested territories. The death of Sviatoslav initiated a succession crisis that would determine the future direction of the Rus state. Sviatoslav had divided his territories among his three sons before departing on his final campaign, with Yaropolk receiving Kiev, Oleg the Drevlian lands, and Vladimir Novgorod. This division, intended to provide for all of Sviatoslav's heirs, instead created the conditions for fratricidal conflict as the brothers competed for supremacy. The resulting civil war would ultimately bring Vladimir to power and set the stage for the most significant transformation in Rus history, the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the state. The succession crisis following Sviatoslav's death plunged the Rus lands into a period of fratricidal conflict that would ultimately reshape the political and religious foundations of the state. The three sons of Sviatoslav, each established in their respective territories, soon found themselves drawn into competition for supremacy over the entire Rus realm. The initial conflict between Yaropolk and Oleg resulted in the death of the younger brother during a military confrontation, an event that eliminated one claimant but intensified the rivalry between the two survivors. Vladimir, learning of his brother Oleg's fate and fearing similar treatment, fled from Novgorod to seek refuge and support among the Varangians of Scandinavia, leaving Yaropolk as the apparent master of all the Rus territories. Vladimir's exile among the Scandinavians provided him with the opportunity to gather military forces and to plan his return to the Rus lands. The connections between the Rurik dynasty and the Scandinavian world remained strong, and Vladimir was able to recruit a substantial force of Varangian warriors willing to support his bid for power. The composition of this force, drawing upon the martial traditions and military expertise of the Scandinavian world, demonstrated the continued importance of Varangian military culture in the political struggles of the Rus state. The warriors who accompanied Vladimir on his return journey represented the latest wave of Scandinavian involvement in Eastern European affairs, continuing a pattern of migration and military service that had characterized the region for over a century. Vladimir's campaign to reclaim his patrimony and to challenge his brother's authority began with the recapture of Novgorod, where he re-established his position and began gathering additional forces for the confrontation with Yaropolk. The strategic importance of Novgorod, controlling the northern terminus of the great trade routes and providing access to the resources and manpower of the northern regions, made it an essential base for any serious challenge to Kievan authority. Vladimir's success in securing Novgorod demonstrated his political skills and his ability to mobilize support among the diverse populations of the Rus north. The campaign against Yaropolk proceeded through a combination of military pressure and political manipulation that revealed Vladimir's sophisticated understanding of power dynamics within the Rus elite. The capture of Polotsk, a strategically important center controlling access to the western Dvina trade route, strengthened Vladimir's position and provided additional resources for the final confrontation. The famous episode of Vladimir's forced marriage to Rogneda, the daughter of the Polotsk prince whom he had killed, illustrated the brutal realities of political competition in this period, while also establishing dynastic connections that would have long-term significance for Rus political geography. The final confrontation between Vladimir and Yaropolk ended not in battle but in treachery, as Vladimir's agents persuaded Yaropolk's advisors to betray their lord. Yaropolk, lured to a meeting with his brother under promises of safe conduct, was murdered by Vladimir's Varangian guards, eliminating the last obstacle to Vladimir's assumption of supreme power over the Rus lands. This violent resolution of the succession crisis established Vladimir as the sole ruler of a reunified Rus state, though the methods by which he achieved this position would later require considerable effort to legitimize through religious transformation and the cultivation of a new political ideology. The early years of Vladimir's reign were characterized by military campaigns that extended and consolidated Rus authority over neighboring peoples and territories. Campaigns against the Viatici, the Radomici, and other Slavic groups that had maintained varying degrees of independence brought these populations more firmly under Kievan control. Expeditions against the Varangians and other Baltic peoples extended Rus influence into the northwestern regions, while campaigns against the Volga Bulgars reasserted Rus interests in the eastern trade routes. These military activities demonstrated Vladimir's energy and ambition, while also serving the practical purpose of providing his Varangian followers with the opportunities for plunder and glory that had motivated their support for his rise to power. The religious policies of Vladimir's early reign reflected the pluralistic character of the Rus state and the diverse spiritual traditions of its population. The chronicle tradition describes Vladimir's construction of a great pagan sanctuary in Kiev, featuring idols of the major deities worshipped by the Slavic and Varangian populations. The idol of Perun, the thunder god particularly associated with the warrior elite, occupied the place of honor in this sanctuary, accompanied by representations of other deities including Kors, Dajbog, Strybog, Simargl, and Mokosh. This apparent revival or formalization of pagan worship, has been interpreted by historians as an attempt to create a unified religious framework for the diverse populations of the Rus state, though the ultimate failure of this project would soon lead Vladimir in a very different direction. The famous account of Vladimir's investigation of various religions, preserved in the primary chronicle, represents one of the most celebrated episodes in early Rus historical tradition. According to this narrative, Vladimir received embassies from representatives of Islam, Judaism, Latin Christianity, and Greek Orthodox Christianity, each presenting the merits of their respective faiths. The chronicle's account of Vladimir's responses to these presentations, while certainly shaped by later Orthodox perspectives, preserves interesting reflections on the criteria by which religious choices might be evaluated. Vladimir's reported rejection of Islam because of its prohibition of alcohol, his dismissal of Judaism because of the loss of the Jewish homeland, and his skepticism toward Latin Christianity, all served to prepare the narrative for the ultimate choice of Orthodox Christianity. The embassy sent by Vladimir to observe religious practices in various lands, and particularly the famous account of the Rus envoy's experience of the Divine Liturgy in the great church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, provided the dramatic climax to this narrative of religious investigation. The envoys report that they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth, so overwhelming was the beauty of the Byzantine liturgical celebration, encapsulated the aesthetic and spiritual appeal of Orthodox Christianity that would prove so influential in shaping Rus religious culture. Whatever the historical accuracy of these specific episodes, they reflect genuine aspects of the process by which the Rus elite came to embrace Byzantine Christianity and the factors that made this particular form of the faith attractive to them. The political and diplomatic dimensions of Vladimir's conversion decision were at least as significant as the spiritual and aesthetic factors emphasized in the chronicle tradition. The Byzantine Empire, despite periods of tension and conflict, represented the most prestigious and sophisticated state with which the Rus had regular contact, and alignment with Byzantine Christianity offered access to the cultural, intellectual, and artistic resources of this great civilization. The conversion also provided opportunities for diplomatic marriages and political alliances that could enhance Rus prestige and security. The negotiations surrounding Vladimir's baptism, which included his demand for a Byzantine princess as his bride, illustrated the intertwining of religious and political considerations in this momentous decision. The circumstances of Vladimir's actual baptism, which according to tradition took place in the Byzantine city of Cherson in Crimea, combined military, diplomatic, and religious elements in a complex sequence of events. Vladimir's siege and capture of Cherson provided him with leverage in his negotiations with the Byzantine emperors Basil II and Constantine VIII, who were facing serious internal challenges and were willing to make significant concessions to secure Rus military assistance. The agreement that emerged from these negotiations included Vladimir's baptism, his marriage to the Byzantine princess Anna, and the provision of Rus military forces to support the Byzantine emperors against their domestic enemies. The Varangian Guard, which would become one of the most famous military units in Byzantine history, traced its origins to this agreement and the warriors sent by Vladimir to Constantinople. The baptism of Vladimir, whenever and wherever it actually occurred, initiated the process of Christianizing the Rus population that would transform the cultural and spiritual landscape of Eastern Europe. The chronicle account of the mass baptism of the Kievan population in the Dnieper River, conducted under Vladimir's orders following his return from Cherson, symbolized the collective nature of this religious transformation. The destruction of the pagan idols, particularly the dramatic treatment of the Perun idol, which was beaten, dragged through the streets, and cast into the river, marked the definitive break with the old religious order and the establishment of Christianity as the official faith of the Rus state. The institutional development of the Rus Church, following Vladimir's conversion, laid the foundations for the ecclesiastical structures that would shape religious life for centuries to come. The establishment of the Metropolitan See of Kiev, subordinate to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, integrated the Rus Church into the broader structures of Orthodox Christianity while providing for local ecclesiastical administration. The construction of churches throughout the Rus lands, beginning with the famous Church of the Tithes in Kiev, created the physical infrastructure for Christian worship and provided visible symbols of the new religious order. The recruitment and training of clergy, initially drawing heavily on Bulgarian and Byzantine personnel but gradually developing indigenous capacity, addressed the practical requirements of ministering to a newly converted population. The cultural consequences of Christianization extended far beyond the strictly religious sphere, transforming virtually every aspect of Rus intellectual and artistic life. The introduction of literacy, based on the Cyrillic alphabet developed for the Slavic languages by Byzantine missionaries, opened access to the vast literary heritage of Orthodox Christianity and provided the tools for the development of indigenous literary traditions. The translation of religious texts, liturgical books, and other works from Greek and Bulgarian into the Slavic vernacular created a body of literature that would form the foundation of Rus intellectual culture. The establishment of schools associated with churches and monasteries began the process of educating a literate elite capable of administering the increasingly complex institutions of church and state. The death of Vladimir in 1015 initiated another succession crisis that would test the resilience of the Rus state and ultimately bring to power the ruler most associated with the flowering of Rus civilization. Vladimir's numerous sons, products of his many marriages and concubines, represented potential claimants to the Kievan throne, and the absence of clear succession principles made conflict among them virtually inevitable. The initial phase of this struggle saw the elimination of several princes, including the famous martyrdom of Boris and Gleb, whose deaths at the hands of their brother Sviatopolk would later be commemorated in one of the earliest works of Rus hagiography and would establish an important precedent for the veneration of princely saints. Sviatopolk, who had seized power in Kiev following Vladimir's death, earned the epithet the accursed in the chronicle tradition for his role in the deaths of his brothers. His brief reign was characterized by the violence and instability that accompanied his efforts to eliminate potential rivals and consolidate his hold on power. The opposition to Sviatopolk coalesced around Yaroslav, who had been established as Prince of Novgorod and who commanded the resources and military forces of the northern regions. The conflict between Sviatopolk and Yaroslav, complicated by the involvement of external powers, including the Polish king Bolesław, continued for several years before Yaroslav's ultimate victory established him as the ruler of the Rus lands. The reign of Yaroslav, who would later receive the epithet the Wise, represented the high point of early Rus civilization, a period during which the political, cultural, and religious achievements of the previous generations reached their fullest development. Yaroslav's long reign, extending from his final victory over Sviatopolk around 1019 until his death in 1054, provided the stability necessary for sustained cultural and institutional development. The 35 years of Yaroslav's rule witnessed the transformation of Kiev into one of the great cities of medieval Europe, the codification of Rus law, the flourishing of literary and artistic production, and the establishment of dynastic connections with the major ruling houses of the continent. The physical transformation of Kiev under Yaroslav's patronage created an urban landscape that rivaled the great cities of Byzantium and Western Europe. The construction of the Cathedral of St. Sophia, modeled on the great church of the same name in Constantinople, provided Kiev with a religious and architectural monument of the first rank. The cathedral's magnificent mosaics and frescoes, executed by Byzantine masters working alongside local artists, represented the highest achievements of medieval religious art and demonstrated the cultural sophistication of the Rus court. The golden domes of St. Sophia, visible from great distances across the Dnieper plain, symbolized the wealth and piety of the Rus state and its ruler. The expansion of Kiev's fortifications under Yaroslav created a city of impressive size and defensive capability. The famous Golden Gate, the ceremonial entrance to the expanded city, combined military functionality with symbolic significance, its gilded decorations proclaiming the wealth and power of the Rus state to all who approached. The new walls enclosed an area many times larger than the original fortress, accommodating the growing population and the numerous churches, monasteries, and other structures that filled the expanding urban space. Archaeological investigations of Yaroslav's Kiev have revealed the sophisticated urban planning and infrastructure that supported this medieval metropolis. The legal codification undertaken during Yaroslav's reign produced the Ruskaya Pravda, the earliest surviving code of Rus law, and one of the most important sources for understanding the social and economic structures of early Rus society. This legal compilation, which would be expanded and modified by subsequent rulers, established principles for the resolution of disputes, the punishment of crimes, and the regulation of economic relationships. The provisions of the Ruskaya Pravda reveal a society characterized by significant social stratification, with different legal protections and penalties applying to different categories of persons. The code's detailed treatment of issues such as theft, assault, property rights, and commercial transactions provides invaluable information about the daily life and social organization of Rus communities. The ecclesiastical developments of Yaroslav's reign strengthened the institutional foundations of the Rus Church and promoted the spread of Christian culture throughout the realm. The appointment of the first metropolitan of Rus origin, Hilarion, represented an important step in the indigenization of church leadership, though the metropolitan see would subsequently return to Byzantine appointees for an extended period. Hilarion's famous Sermon on Law and Grace, one of the masterpieces of early Rus literature, articulated a sophisticated theological vision that placed the Rus among the Christian peoples and celebrated the achievements of Vladimir and Yaroslav in bringing their people to the true faith. The monastic movement, which would play such an important role in Rus' religious and cultural life, received significant impetus during Yaroslav's reign. The foundation of the monastery of the caves, Pechursk Lavra, near Kiev, which would become the most important monastic center in the Rus lands, established a model of ascetic spirituality and communal religious life that would be replicated throughout the Orthodox Slavic world. The monks of the Caves Monastery would produce some of the most important works of early Rus literature, including chronicles, hagiographies, and spiritual writings that shaped the religious consciousness of subsequent generations. The diplomatic achievements of Yaroslav's reign established the Rus state as a recognized member of the European political community, connected by marriage alliances to the major ruling dynasties of the continent. Yaroslav himself married Ingigerd, daughter of the Swedish king, while his children married into the royal houses of France, Hungary, Norway, and other European kingdoms. His daughter Anna became Queen of France through her marriage to Henry I, bringing Rus culture and connections to the French court. These marriage alliances reflected the prestige of the Rus state under Yaroslav's rule and created networks of diplomatic relationships that would influence European politics for generations. The intellectual and literary achievements of Yaroslav's reign laid the foundations for the distinctive traditions of Rus culture that would develop over subsequent centuries. The establishment of schools, the collection of books, and the patronage of translation projects created the infrastructure for intellectual life and ensured the transmission of Byzantine learning to the Slavic world. The chronicle tradition, which would preserve the memory of Rus history for future generations, received significant development during this period, with the compilation of historical records and the elaboration of narrative frameworks that would shape subsequent historiography. The military campaigns of Yaroslav's reign, while less dramatic than those of his predecessors, successfully defended and extended Rus territories. The defeat of the Pechenegs in 1036, which effectively ended their threat to the Rus heartland, removed a persistent security challenge and opened the steppe frontier to Rus settlement and economic exploitation. Campaigns in the Baltic region against the Varangians and other peoples extended Rus influence in the northwest, while expeditions against the Byzantines, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated the continued military capabilities of the Rus state. The succession arrangements made by Yaroslav before his death in 1054 attempted to provide for the orderly transfer of power to the next generation while accommodating the claims of his multiple sons. The system established by Yaroslav, known as the Rota or ladder system, assigned each of his sons to a specific principality ranked in order of importance, with the expectation that princes would advance through the hierarchy as senior members died. Kiev, as the most prestigious principality, was reserved for the senior member of the dynasty, while other major centers such as Chernigov, Pereyaslavl, and Novgorod were assigned to junior princes according to their place in the seniority order. The succession system established by Yaroslav the Wise, whatever its intentions, contained inherent contradictions that would generate conflict and ultimately contribute to the political fragmentation of the Rus lands. The Rota system assumed that princes would patiently await their turn to advance through the hierarchy of principalities, accepting their current positions while anticipating future promotion as senior relatives died. In practice, however, the system created numerous opportunities for dispute as princes disagreed about the proper interpretation of seniority rules, contested the claims of rivals, and sought to advance their own interests through military force or political manipulation. The first generation after Yaroslav's death witnessed the emergence of tensions that would characterize Rus political life for the remainder of the medieval period. The three senior sons of Yaroslav, Izyaslav, Sviatoslav, and Vsevolod, initially cooperated in a triumvirate arrangement that maintained relative stability, but this cooperation eventually broke down as competing interests and ambitions came into conflict. The complex sequence of depositions, restorations, and renewed conflicts that characterized the relationships among Yaroslav's sons and their descendants illustrated the fundamental instability of the succession system and the difficulty of maintaining unity among the proliferating branches of the Rurik dynasty. The multiplication of princely lines, as each generation produced numerous sons, created an increasingly complex web of competing claims and potential conflicts. The descendants of each of Yaroslav's sons formed distinct dynastic branches, each with its own territorial base and political interests. The Izyaslavichi, Sviatoslavichi, and Vsevolodichi, and their subsequent subdivisions, competed for position within the overall hierarchy while also developing distinct identities and traditions associated with their particular territories. This process of dynastic differentiation gradually transformed the unified Rus state into a collection of related but increasingly autonomous principalities. The territorial dimension of this fragmentation reflected the diverse geographical and economic characteristics of the various regions that comprise the Rus lands. The Principality of Novgorod, with its distinctive republican institutions and its orientation toward Baltic trade, developed political traditions quite different from those of the southern principalities centered on Kiev. The northeastern regions, including the principalities of Rostov, Suzdal, and later Vladimir, emerged as increasingly important centers of population and economic activity, eventually rivaling and surpassing the older centers of the south. The western principalities of Galicia and Volhynia developed their own distinctive characteristics, influenced by their proximity to Poland and Hungary and their involvement in Central European political networks. The institutional developments that accompanied political fragmentation created new frameworks for governance that would prove remarkably durable. Each principality developed its own administrative apparatus, its own military forces, and its own relationships with the church hierarchy and the urban populations within its territories. The boyar councils that advised princes in each principality acquired increasing influence, sometimes constraining princely authority and occasionally playing decisive roles in political conflicts. The urban assemblies known as Vich, particularly prominent in Novgorod but present in other cities as well, provided mechanisms for popular participation in political decisions and sometimes challenged princely authority directly. The economic consequences of political fragmentation were complex and not uniformly negative. While the disruption of unified authority certainly created obstacles to long-distance trade and increased the costs of commercial activity, the competition among principalities also stimulated economic development, as each sought to attract merchants and craftsmen to its territories. The growth of regional centers created new markets and new opportunities for economic specialization, while the development of local industries reduced dependence on long-distance trade for many essential goods. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals continued urban growth, craft production, and commercial activity, suggesting that economic life remained vibrant despite political instability. The cultural developments of the fragmentation period demonstrated the resilience and creativity of Rus civilization, even as political unity dissolved. Each major principality became a center of cultural production, with princely courts patronizing artists, architects, and writers who created works reflecting local traditions and interests. The chronicle tradition, which had been centered in Kiev during the period of unity, diversified as regional centers developed their own historical narratives emphasizing local achievements and perspectives. The architectural monuments constructed in various principalities during this period, while drawing on common Byzantine and Kievan traditions, developed distinctive regional styles that reflected local tastes and resources. The religious life of the Rus lands continued to develop and deepen during the fragmentation period, with the church providing one of the few institutions that maintained connections across political boundaries. The Metropolitan of Kiev, though his authority was sometimes challenged and his movements between principalities were sometimes restricted by political conflicts, continued to represent the unity of the Rus Church and to provide a framework for ecclesiastical administration that transcended princely divisions. The monastic movement continued to expand, with new foundations in various principalities, creating centers of spiritual life and cultural production that served both local and broader communities. The military dimensions of the fragmentation period were characterized by frequent conflicts among princes, punctuated by occasional cooperation against external threats. The internecine warfare among Rurikid princes, while rarely resulting in the complete destruction of defeated parties, consumed resources, disrupted economic life, and weakened the collective capacity of the Rus lands to respond to external challenges. The steppe frontier remained a persistent concern, as new nomadic peoples, particularly the Cumans, Palavci, replaced the Pechenegs as the primary threat from the south. The relationships between Rus princes and the Cumans combined warfare with diplomacy and intermarriage, creating complex patterns of conflict and cooperation that varied according to the interests and circumstances of particular princes and Cuman leaders. The attempts to restore unity, or at least to regulate competition among princes through collective agreements, represented one response to the challenges of fragmentation. The famous Congress of Lübeck in 1097, which brought together the major princes to establish principles for resolving disputes and allocating territories, illustrated both the desire for order and the difficulty of achieving lasting agreements. The principle articulated at Lübeck, that each prince should hold his patrimony, represented a significant departure from the Rota system's assumption of rotation through a hierarchy of principalities, effectively acknowledging the transformation of the Rus lands into a collection of hereditary principalities, rather than a unified state with rotating leadership. The social and economic structures of Rus society continued to evolve during the fragmentation period, with significant developments in the relationships among different social groups. The position of the peasant population, which constituted the vast majority of the Rus population, varied according to local conditions and the policies of particular princes and landowners. The growth of large landed estates, often associated with princely families, boyars, or ecclesiastical institutions, created new frameworks for agricultural production and new forms of dependence for the rural population. The urban populations, while generally small relative to the total population, played increasingly important roles in economic life and sometimes in political affairs as well. The intellectual and literary production of the fragmentation period, while building on the foundations established during the period of unity, developed new themes and forms that reflected the changed political circumstances. The chronicle tradition continued to flourish, with regional compilations preserving local perspectives on events and celebrating local achievements. Hagiographical literature expanded as new saints were recognized and their lives recorded for the edification of the faithful. The tale of Igor's campaign, one of the masterpieces of medieval Rus literature, emerged from this period. Its lament for the disunity of the Rus princes and its call for collective action against the steppe nomads reflecting the concerns of an era of fragmentation and conflict. The developments of the late 12th and early 13th centuries set the stage for the most dramatic transformation in the history of the Rus lands, though contemporaries could not have anticipated the catastrophe that awaited them. The political fragmentation that had characterized the previous century continued and even intensified, with the number of principalities multiplying and the conflicts among princes showing no signs of resolution. The northeastern principalities, particularly Vladimir Suzdal, under the rule of energetic princes such as Andrei Bogolyubsky and Vsevolod the Third Big Nest, emerged as increasingly important centers of power, challenging the traditional primacy of Kiev and shifting the political center of gravity of the Rus lands toward the northeast. The reign of Andrei Bogolyubsky in Vladimir Suzdal represented a significant departure from traditional patterns of Rus political culture. Andrei's decision to remain in the northeast, rather than claiming the Kievan throne when opportunity arose, His construction of magnificent churches and palaces in Vladimir and nearby Bogolyubovo, and his autocratic style of rule all pointed toward new conceptions of princely authority that would influence subsequent developments. The famous sack of Kiev by Andrei's forces in 1169, which subjected the ancient capital to treatment previously reserved for foreign enemies, symbolized the declining prestige of Kiev and the emergence of new centers of power that no longer acknowledged its primacy. The cultural achievements of the northeastern principalities during this period demonstrated that political fragmentation did not preclude artistic and intellectual flourishing. The churches constructed in Vladimir and Suzdal, with their distinctive white stone architecture and elaborate carved decoration, represented the highest achievements of Rus architectural art and created models that would influence subsequent building throughout the Orthodox Slavic world. The literary production of the Northeast, including chronicles, hagiographies, and other works, contributed to the overall richness of Rus culture, while also articulating regional perspectives and celebrating local achievements. The western principalities of Galicia and Volhynia experienced their own distinctive development during this period, with the emergence of powerful rulers who created one of the most significant political formations of the late Rus period. The unification of Galicia and Volhynia under Roman Mstislavich, and subsequently under his son Daniel, created a principality capable of playing a significant role in the complex politics of Central Europe. The relationships of the Galician Volhynian princes with Poland, Hungary, and the papacy created diplomatic networks quite different from those of the eastern principalities, and opened possibilities for cultural and political influences from the Latin West. The commercial and urban development of the Rus lands continued during this period, with significant growth in both established centers and newly founded towns. The cities of the Northeast, including Vladimir, Suzdal, and the newly founded Moscow, grew in population and economic importance, while the older centers of the South and West maintained their commercial functions despite political instability. The development of craft production, the expansion of local and regional trade, and the continued participation in long-distance commercial networks all contributed to economic growth that supported the cultural achievements of the period. The ecclesiastical developments of the late 12th and early 13th centuries reflected both the continued vitality of Rus religious life and the challenges posed by political fragmentation. The multiplication of episcopal sees, the foundation of new monasteries, and the construction of churches throughout the Rus lands demonstrated the depth of Christian commitment among the population and the continued patronage of religious institutions by princes and other wealthy donors. The tensions between the metropolitan authorities centered in Kiev and the emerging power centers in the northeast created ecclesiastical as well as political challenges, as princes sought to establish religious institutions that would serve their particular interests and enhance their prestige. The social structures of Rus society in this period showed both continuities with earlier patterns and significant developments that would shape subsequent history. The boyar class, whose members served as advisors, administrators, and military commanders for the various princes, developed increasingly strong connections to particular territories and sometimes challenged princely authority when their interests conflicted. The urban populations, organized in various craft and commercial associations, played important roles in the economic life of the cities and occasionally intervened in political affairs through the Vesh assemblies. The rural population, comprising the vast majority of the Rus people, continued to work the land under various arrangements that ranged from relative independence to significant dependence on landlords. The military organization of the Rus principalities in this period combined traditional elements with innovations responding to changing circumstances. The princely retinues, družiny, remained the core of military forces, supplemented by levies from the urban and rural populations when larger forces were required. The equipment and tactics of Rus warriors reflected both indigenous traditions and influences from neighboring peoples, including the steppe nomads whose military techniques had long influenced Rus warfare. The fortifications constructed during this period, including both urban defenses and frontier strongholds, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military architecture and the resources available for defensive construction. The relationships between the Rus principalities and the steppe peoples continued to shape the political and military history of the region. The Cumans, who had dominated the steppe frontier for over a century, maintained complex relationships with various Rus princes that combined warfare, diplomacy, and intermarriage. Some princes allied with Cuman leaders against their Rus rivals, while others organized campaigns against the nomads that sometimes achieved significant successes. The steppe frontier remained a zone of interaction and exchange as well as conflict, with commercial relationships, cultural influences, and population movements crossing the boundary between the settled and nomadic worlds. The first reports of a new and terrifying force emerging from the depths of Asia reached the Rus lands in the early 13th century, though their full significance was not immediately apparent. The Mongol conquests, which had already transformed the political landscape of Central Asia and were beginning to affect the peoples of the Western Steppe, would soon bring unprecedented destruction to the Rus lands and fundamentally alter the course of their subsequent history. The Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, where a combined Rus-Cuman force suffered catastrophic defeat at the hands of a Mongol reconnaissance expedition, provided a terrifying preview of the military capabilities of this new enemy, though the Mongols withdrew after this victory and did not return for more than a decade. The period between the Kalka River battle and the full-scale Mongol invasion of 1237 to 1240 saw no fundamental changes in the political organization of the Rus lands, as princes continued their familiar patterns of competition and conflict without adequately preparing for the existential threat that awaited them. The fragmentation that had characterized Rus political life for generations now proved fatal, as the divided principalities proved incapable of mounting effective collective resistance to the Mongol onslaught. The destruction that followed, which devastated cities, decimated populations, and ended the independence of the Rus principalities, marked the conclusion of one era of Rus history and the beginning of another that would unfold under the shadow of Mongol domination. The long-term implications of the developments initiated during this period would fundamentally shape the subsequent history of the Rus territories, as the precedents established for regional autonomy and the institutional frameworks created for managing political fragmentation would persist long after the original circumstances that created them had disappeared. The Rota system's unintended consequences had transformed a unified realm into a collection of related but increasingly independent principalities, each developing its own institutional traditions and cultural identity, while maintaining nominal allegiance to shared Rurik heritage and Christian faith. This transformation represented not the decline of Rus civilization, but rather its evolution into a more complex and diverse form that would prove remarkably resilient in the face of future challenges, including the Mongol invasions that would test the strength of these newly autonomous political structures in ways that their creators could never have anticipated.